Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The Anarchy when England forgot who was king. You wake in a timber-framed house with a dirt floor, the smoke from last night's hearth still clinging to the beams. Outside, the sound that reaches you is not birdsong but the distant rhythm of hammers striking wood and iron. Somewhere nearby, a new fortification is being raised. No one asked permission. No one needed to. This is England in the middle decades of the 12th century, during a period later remembered simply as the anarchy, not because people at the time used that word, but because no better one was found afterward. Order did not collapse all at once. It leaked away slowly, like water through a cracked vessel, until one day you realized there was nothing left to hold. The trouble began with a death that should have been ordinary. Henry I, ruler of England and much of Normandy, died in 1135 after a short illness. He left behind wealth, castles, laws, and experienced administrators. What he did not leave was a universally accepted heir. His only legitimate son had drowned years earlier in the White Ship disaster, a tragedy still spoken of in hushed tones along the coasts. In response, Henry had done what he could. He made his nobles swear an oath to accept his daughter as ruler after him. Her name was Empress Matilda, a woman with imperial training, political experience, and a temperament that did not invite easy affection. But oaths made in quiet halls are fragile things. When Henry's body was barely cold, his nephew Stephen of Blois crossed the Channel, gathered support, and had himself crowned king. It happened quickly, efficiently, and with enough noble backing to make resistance seem impractical. At first, life went on much as before. Coins were still minted, courts still met, crops still needed planting, but beneath these familiar rhythms was an unease that settled into the bones. Two people claimed the same crown, and neither could remove the other. For ordinary people like you, this was not a matter of ideology or dynastic principle. It was a question of whose soldiers would arrive first, and whether they would leave anything behind when they went. Stephen's rule began with generosity. He confirmed old rights, forgave debts, and allowed nobles wide latitude. It seemed like mercy. In practice, it was permission. Across England, local lords began building castles, many without royal approval. These were not the grand stone fortresses you imagine, but hastily constructed wooden strongholds, thrown up on mounds of earth. They rose quickly, and once finished, they rarely came down. Each castle required supplies: grain, livestock, timber, labor. If you owned land nearby, it was no longer truly yours. You paid in food, in days of work, sometimes in sons sent to carry arms. Refusal was dangerous. There was always another village to plunder, but yours might be closer. Chroniclers later wrote that Christ and his saints were asleep. It was a poetic way of saying that justice had stopped functioning. Sheriffs no longer enforced law consistently. Royal courts lost authority as allegiance shifted from month to month. If you were robbed, there was no guarantee that anyone had the power or interest to help you. When Matilda eventually arrived to press her claim, the conflict sharpened. Support divided along family lines, regional loyalties, and personal grievances. Some barons changed sides more than once, depending on who offered better terms. Loyalty became transactional. Memory became short. Armies in this period were not vast, disciplined forces. They were bands of retainers, mercenaries, and pressed locals, moving slowly and living off the land. When they passed through, fields were trampled, fences burned for firewood, and livestock driven away. Even if no battle occurred, damage was done. You might survive one such visit, two would strain you, three could break you entirely. Food scarcity became common, not because the land could not produce, but because production was constantly interrupted. A planted field might never be harvested. A harvest might never reach storage. Grain stolen in summer meant hunger in winter. Churches, once places of refuge, were not always safe. While outright sacrilege was officially condemned, desperation blurred boundaries. Monasteries were raided. Priests negotiated with armed men like any other landholders. Faith persisted, but protection did not. Stephen himself was not a cruel man by nature. He rode with his troops, listened to petitions, and tried sometimes to restrain excess. But he was trapped by the very compromises that put him on the throne. Each attempt to assert authority risked losing the support he depended on. Matilda, for her part, struggled to gain acceptance. Her claim was lawful by oath, but custom resisted her. She demanded obedience rather than courting it, and in a fractured kingdom, demands carried little weight without force. For you, none of this mattered in the abstract. What mattered was whether the road was safe today, whether the local lord had changed banners overnight, whether the men at the gate wore familiar colors or new ones. Children grew up knowing the sound of approaching hooves before they learned their letters. Old men remembered quieter reigns and spoke of them as if recalling a different world. Women managed households with an eye always on scarcity, storing what they could, hiding what they must. This was not constant war. Battles were infrequent, sieges slow, campaigns seasonal. And yet the violence felt unending because there was no clear direction, no promise of resolution, just waiting, enduring, adjusting. As winter approached each year, you wondered whether the coming spring would bring planting or soldiers, whether the castle on the hill would still demand tribute, whether the king you had never seen would still claim authority over your life. And somewhere beyond your village, two rulers continued their quiet, grinding contest, neither able to fully win, neither willing to yield. The question was no longer who had the better claim, but how long a kingdom could exist in this in-between state before something essential finally broke. So as the days shortened and the roads grew muddy, one uneasy thought lingered. What happens to a land when uncertainty becomes its only constant? By the time a full decade had passed, uncertainty was no longer new. It had become routine. You did not wake each morning expecting peace. You woke expecting variation. A different lord, a different demand, a different set of rules hastily explained and loosely enforced. Castles now dotted the countryside like a spreading rash. Some were held for the king, some for the empress, many for whoever happened to occupy them that season. They were called adulterine castles, later unlicensed, unauthorized, but at the time they were simply facts of life. Each one was a center of gravity, pulling food, labor, and fear toward itself. If you lived nearby, you learned quickly how to behave. You learned when to be visible and when to disappear. You learned that silence was safer than protest, and that compliance, though costly, was often less dangerous than resistance. Survival was not heroic, it was practical. The men who controlled these fortresses were not always great nobles. Many were minor lords, knights with ambition, or families who saw opportunity in confusion. Loyalty was flexible. Allegiance could be revised. A banner raised today might be lowered tomorrow if better terms arrived with the next messenger. Both claimants to the throne understood this, and both fed the system they publicly condemned. Stephen of Blois granted lands and titles he did not securely control. Empress Matilda promised recognition and reward to those willing to endure short-term risk for long-term legitimacy. The kingdom became a marketplace of promises. In theory, war required armies. In practice, it required patience. Campaigning was slow, dependent on weather, supply, and the willingness of men to follow orders that might lead nowhere. Many confrontations ended not with battle, but with negotiation. A siege might drag on for months, ending in surrender rather than slaughter. For you, the difference was minimal. A besieged castle still needed food. If its stores ran low, the surrounding countryside paid the difference. Livestock vanished first, then grain, then anything that could be burned for heat or light. Captivity became common. Not the dramatic kind sung about later, but a transactional one. Lords captured rivals not to kill them, but to hold them. Prisoners were assets. Ransoms were calculated carefully, adjusted for status, family wealth, and political usefulness. Even lesser men might be detained briefly, pressured into service, or forced to swear oaths they barely understood. If you were unlucky enough to be taken, survival depended on restraint and value. You learned not to anger your captor, not to fall ill, not to appear worthless. A living prisoner could be exchanged. A dead one could not. The church tried fitfully to intervene. Bishops preached peace, called councils, and issued condemnations. Sometimes it worked. More often it was ignored. Clergy themselves were divided, some supporting Stephen, others Matilda. Even sanctuaries became politicized. In 1141, the balance shifted briefly. Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln, taken prisoner after a chaotic fight that left many dead and more scattered. For a moment, it seemed the conflict might end. Matilda entered London, prepared to be crowned. But victory in war did not translate to acceptance in rule. The city resisted her demands. Negotiations broke down. Support evaporated as quickly as it had formed. Before long, Stephen was released in a prisoner exchange, and the war resumed as if nothing decisive had happened. For people like you, this moment was especially bitter. You had endured years of hardship, and when resolution finally appeared within reach, it slipped away not because of battle, but because of mistrust, pride, and fear of change. The fighting dragged on. Seasons blurred together. Children born after the war grew up knowing nothing else. They learned which roads to avoid, which colors meant danger, and how to hide valuables in plain sight. Trade suffered quietly. Markets still existed, but movement was risky. Coinage circulated unevenly. Some regions hoarded silver, others relied on barter. Long-distance commerce shrank, not from policy but from caution. Risk had become expensive. Law, where it survived, became local. Justice depended on who held power that week. A crime punished in one village might be ignored in the next. Memory replaced record. Reputation replaced proof. Yet life did not stop. People married. Fields were planted when possible. Festivals were observed, though more subdued. There was resilience in routine, even when routine was fragile. As the years passed, something subtle changed. The great ambitions of both sides began to dull. Older leaders died. Younger ones inherited grudges they barely understood. The cost of endless conflict became harder to ignore. You might not have noticed it at first, but negotiations grew quieter, more serious. Messengers traveled not just with threats but with questions. Not how to win, but how to end. The war had no clear villain and no clear hero. It had simply worn the kingdom down. And as exhaustion settled over England, a new possibility emerged: not victory, but compromise. The question was no longer who deserved the crown, but whether the land itself could survive many more years of indecision. And so, as another winter approached and another harvest failed to fully reach its barns, one uneasy thought surfaced again. What kind of peace could possibly come from a war that had taught everyone how to live without one? By the time the fighting began to slow, it did not feel like an ending. There were no celebrations, no sense that something had been decisively won. Instead, there was fatigue, deep, collective, and unremarkable, the kind that settles into the land itself. You felt it in smaller ways first. Fewer armed men on the roads, fewer sudden demands for grain, a castle garrison that stopped expanding its fortifications and began repairing what already stood. These were not signs of peace exactly, but they were signs that urgency had faded. The war had lasted nearly 2 decades. For many, it had consumed the entirety of adult life. Children born when the first banners were raised were now old enough to remember nothing else. To them, instability was not a crisis, it was normal. The resolution, when it finally came, did not arrive through conquest. It arrived through acceptance of limits. Both sides understood what could not be achieved. Stephen of Blois had never fully secured his authority and likely never would. Empress Matilda had failed to claim the crown in her own right, despite years of effort. The question shifted from who should rule now to who could rule next. That distinction mattered. In 1153, an agreement was reached that later chroniclers would call the Treaty of Wallingford. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life. In return, he would recognize Matilda's son as his heir. The boy, already a young man by then, had grown up amid war, learning politics as something lived rather than studied. His name was Henry II. When Stephen died the following year, there was no scramble for the crown, no rival coronation, no sudden collapse into violence. Henry crossed to England and was crowned with a degree of order that felt almost unfamiliar. For you, the change was subtle but real. Royal authority began to assert itself again, not dramatically, but persistently. Unlicensed castles were dismantled. Some lords resisted, but many did not. They were tired. The rewards of independence no longer outweighed the risks. Law returned slowly. Sheriffs were reinstated. Courts resumed with something approaching consistency. Records were kept. Disputes were written down rather than remembered. It was not justice as an ideal, but it was predictability, and after years of chaos, predictability felt like mercy. The scars of the war did not vanish. Villages abandoned during the worst years remained empty. Fields reclaimed slowly, if at all. Some families never returned. Others had adapted too well to instability to trust permanence. Castles that had once terrorized the countryside were left as husks, timber rotting, earthworks eroding. They were reminders of how quickly power could be seized and how difficult it was to give up once taken. Henry II's reign is often remembered for reform, but those reforms were shaped by what came before. He understood, perhaps better than most kings, how fragile authority could be. He tightened control over castles, over justice, over administration, not out of abstraction, but out of memory. For ordinary people, this meant fewer surprises. Taxes were still collected, obligations still existed, but they were clearer, more consistent, less subject to the whim of whichever lord happened to pass through. You still worked the same land. You still worried about weather, disease, and hunger. Medieval life remained hard, but the particular fear of sudden, arbitrary violence receded. What lingered instead was memory. People remembered which neighbors had collaborated, which lords had switched sides, which families had profited while others starved. These memories shaped local relationships for generations. The war ended, but its social consequences endured quietly. The chroniclers, writing later, struggled to summarize the period. They spoke of suffering, of lawlessness, of divine abandonment. But they rarely described the monotony, the waiting, the adjustments, the ways people learned to live inside uncertainty rather than constantly resist it. From a distance, the anarchy looks like a failure of succession. Up close, it was a lesson in endurance, not just of kings and claimants, but of farmers, craftsmen, widows, and children who found ways to persist without knowing when stability would return. It also reshaped the English crown itself. After years of weakness, kingship emerged more centralized, more cautious, and more suspicious of unchecked power. The chaos had taught hard lessons. And yet, one uncomfortable truth remained. The war had ended not because it was resolved, but because it had exhausted everyone involved. If you stood in a quiet field years later, watching crops grow where soldiers once marched, you might wonder whether the peace was truly earned or merely accepted, because no one had the strength to continue fighting. And that leaves a final question hanging in the air, long after the banners were lowered and the castles dismantled. Did England learn from the anarchy, or did it simply survive it, waiting, as kingdoms often do, for the next time certainty breaks apart? Story 2. The War of the Roses, cousins, crowns, and quiet cruelties. You are born into a world where surnames matter more than seasons, and ancestry weighs heavier than weather. In 15th century England, the past is not distant, it presses constantly against the present, shaping expectations, grievances, and fears. Long before the first battle is fought, the War of the Roses has already begun in conversation, in legal arguments, and in private resentment. At its surface, the conflict appears simple enough. Two branches of the same royal family, Lancaster and York, each claiming the English throne. Their symbols, the red rose and the white, would later give the wars their poetic name. But to live through this period is to realize how misleading that simplicity is. This was not a single war, nor a clean division of sides. It was a series of struggles spread across decades, marked by pauses, reversals, and long stretches where nothing seemed resolved at all. The root of the problem lay generations earlier with the long reign of Edward III. He had many sons. At the time, this seemed a blessing. In retrospect, it was a structural flaw. Each son founded a lineage, each with a plausible claim to royal authority. As long as kings ruled effectively, these claims remained theoretical. When kings faltered, they became dangerous. By the middle of the 15th century, the crown rested on the head of Henry VI, a man ill-suited to the demands of medieval kingship. He was gentle, devout, and deeply uncomfortable with conflict. Worse, he suffered from periods of profound mental incapacity, during which he was unable to speak, recognize people, or make decisions. For you, as an ordinary subject, Henry's weakness is not a philosophical issue. It manifests in uncertainty. Orders contradict each other. Authority fragments. Powerful men argue over who speaks for the king when the king cannot speak for himself. Into this space steps Richard of York, a man with royal blood, military experience, and a strong belief that poor governance was not merely unfortunate but illegitimate. At first, he does not openly claim the throne. He claims competence, reform, order. These are persuasive words in a tired kingdom. England at this time is not collapsing, but it is strained. The long wars in France have ended badly. Trade fluctuates. Noble rivalries simmer just below the surface. Law exists, but enforcement depends heavily on local power. Private armies, retainers wearing a lord's badge are common. You may never see a battlefield, but you will see armed men more often than you would like. What makes this conflict particularly unsettling is how personal it feels. The leaders know each other. They are cousins, uncles, in-laws. Disputes are framed not as foreign invasions but as corrections, restorations, rightful adjustments. Violence is justified as necessity. When fighting finally breaks out in 1455 at the First Battle of St. Albans, it is brief, chaotic, and shocking. It takes place in streets and gardens, not open fields. Prominent nobles die suddenly. The king is wounded. And just like that, the unspoken tensions become irreversible. For people like you, the aftermath is confusing. There is no clear declaration of war. Life continues. Markets reopen. Crops still need harvesting. But the knowledge has settled in. Powerful men are now willing to kill each other openly. The years that follow are defined by instability rather than constant combat. Governments rise and fall. Henry VI is alternately king and captive. Parliament meets under pressure. Oaths are sworn, broken, and quietly ignored. The war does not advance in a straight line. There are long pauses where compromise seems possible. Each pause raises hope and makes the next outbreak of violence more bitter. Noble families hedge their bets. Some send one son to support Lancaster, another York. Marriage becomes political strategy. Neutrality is attempted, rarely achieved. For you, neutrality may not even be an option. If your lord chooses a side, you follow. If your town lies near a strategic road, it will be used. If supplies are needed, they will be taken with or without compensation. Battles themselves are terrifying but relatively rare. What wears people down is the uncertainty in between. A king today may be a prisoner tomorrow. A law passed this year may be overturned the next. Property rights become unstable when ownership depends on loyalty. Rumors travel faster than armies. You hear of executions, attainders, lands confiscated. You hear that yesterday's victor is today's traitor. Memory becomes dangerous. Speaking too freely about past allegiances can cost you everything. And yet, despite the violence, the kingdom does not feel entirely broken. That may be the most unsettling part. Life goes on enough that endurance seems possible. There is always the hope that this turn, this settlement, this council will finally end things. As the 1460s approach, the conflict sharpens. Claims become explicit. The question is no longer who should advise the king, but who should be the king. Blood ties that once restrained violence now justify it. You may sense, even without understanding the legal arguments, that something has shifted. The crown is no longer just inherited, it is contested, and once a crown can be taken, it can be taken again. Which raises an uneasy thought as the country edges closer to full civil war. If kingship itself has become conditional, what does that mean for everyone whose lives depend on its stability? By the time the conflict deepens, you no longer think in terms of beginnings. You think in terms of reversals. Who was in favor last year? Who is dangerous to acknowledge now? Which prayers should be spoken aloud and which kept private? The defining feature of the War of the Roses is not constant bloodshed, but instability that never fully settles. Kings rise, fall, return, and fall again. Authority becomes something provisional, valid only until the next battle or betrayal. After years of maneuvering, the struggle hardens around two figures who could not be more different in temperament. On one side is Edward IV, son of Richard of York. He is tall, physically imposing, confident, and decisive, everything Henry VI was not. On the other side remains Henry VI, increasingly fragile, increasingly symbolic. When Edward takes the throne in 1461 after a series of brutal engagements, including the massive and devastating Battle of Toten, it feels briefly like the conflict might be over. Toten is remembered not just for its scale, but for its weather, snow blowing into men's faces, confusion compounding slaughter. For you, even if you are nowhere near the battlefield, its impact is immediate. Casualties ripple outward. Families lose breadwinners. Villages absorb wounded men who will never fight or work the same way again. Edward's rule brings a kind of order, but it is not peace. He rewards supporters generously, confiscating lands from Lancastrians and redistributing them. Property changes hands not through inheritance, but through victory. Titles are reassigned. Old hierarchies are reshuffled. If your livelihood depends on a local lord, this matters deeply. A manor that was lenient last year may now be harsh. Obligations change. Expectations tighten. Loyalty is measured not by long service, but by recent usefulness. What makes this period particularly exhausting is the sense that nothing is permanent. Edward is strong, but his claim rests on success. If he loses, everything he grants can be undone, and that possibility never disappears. The instability intensifies when Edward makes a personal decision that ripples across the kingdom. He marries for love rather than strategy. His union with Elizabeth Woodville elevates her family rapidly, creating resentment among older nobles who feel sidelined. Politics, as always, turns inward. Among those who grow dissatisfied is Richard Neville, once Edward's greatest supporter. Warwick had helped put Edward on the throne. Now he helps take him off it. For you, this betrayal confirms what you already suspect. Allegiance is temporary. Even the most powerful relationships can collapse. Even the king can be overthrown by those who made him. In 1470, Warwick restores Henry VI to the throne. The reversal is so abrupt that it feels unreal. One day Edward's authority seems secure. The next, he is in exile, and the old, broken king is paraded again as ruler. This brief restoration does not bring relief. It brings anxiety. People scramble to adjust. Documents are reissued. Oaths are renewed. Some men are punished for being too loyal to the wrong king. Others survive by claiming they were always on the correct side, whatever that now means. You learn to speak carefully, to remember selectively, to emphasize obedience over belief. The return of Edward IV in 1471 is swift and decisive. He defeats Warwick, who dies in battle, and shortly afterward Henry VI dies in the Tower of London. Officially, it is said to be natural causes. Few believe it. With Henry's death, one branch of the conflict appears extinguished. Edward rules again, stronger than before. For a time, the kingdom stabilizes. Trade improves. Administration tightens. The constant fear of reversal eases just slightly. But the war has already taught everyone a dangerous lesson. Kingship is not sacred. It is achievable. And if achievable, it is repeatable. This understanding seeps downward. Lesser disputes escalate faster. Violence becomes a more acceptable solution. If a king can be removed, why not a rival lord? If inheritance can be overturned, why respect custom at all? Daily life reflects this tension. Retainers remain armed. Feuds linger. Justice is still filtered through power. The courts function, but their authority is always shadowed by the memory of recent chaos. You may feel relief during these quieter years, but it is cautious relief. You know now that peace can be undone quickly, not by foreign invasion, but by internal fracture. When Edward IV dies unexpectedly in 1483, the old dread returns almost instantly. His heir is a boy. The question of guardianship opens the door to ambition. The machinery of instability, so carefully assembled over decades, begins to move again. You have seen this before. You know how it ends, or rather, how it doesn't end cleanly. As rumors spread and factions align, one final, chilling realization settles in. The war is no longer about Lancaster versus York alone. It is about what happens when power itself has learned how to justify taking what it wants. And as the kingdom edges once more toward violence, you cannot help but wonder. After so many reversals, can anyone still remember what a secure crown is supposed to look like? When Edward IV dies in 1483, there is no sense of closure, only acceleration. His death is sudden, inconvenient, and destabilizing. You have learned by now what this combination means. The kingdom does not pause to mourn, it recalculates. The heir is a child, Edward V, and childhood in this era is not a protected state. It is a vulnerability. Regents gather, councils convene, guards are posted where trust once sufficed. The question of who will speak for the king quickly becomes the question of who will replace him. Into this uncertainty steps Richard III, Edward IV's younger brother. At first, his role appears practical: protector of the realm, stabilizer of succession. For you, this distinction is academic. What matters is that armed men once again fill the roads, that proclamations are read and reread, and that rumors thicken the air. Within weeks, the young king and his brother disappear into the Tower of London. Official explanations are sparse. Reassurances are offered. None of them travel far. Richard is crowned. This final act of the Wars of the Roses does not erupt in widespread fighting immediately. Instead, it spreads through doubt. People remember too much now to accept appearances at face value. The kingdom has been trained to question legitimacy, to look for precedent, to expect reversal. Richard's rule is efficient, even reform-minded in some respects. Laws are clarified. Justice is presented as impartial. But beneath this order lies a foundation that feels brittle. Too many transitions have happened too quickly. Too many heirs have vanished quietly. For you, the unease manifests in small behaviors. You avoid discussing politics altogether. You keep your household neutral. You learn which prayers to emphasize publicly and which to whisper at home. The habit of caution, developed over decades, has not faded. Opposition forms not as an ideology, but as a reaction. Men who once fought for York now fight against a Yorkist king. The war has lost its original shape. It is no longer about roses. It is about exhaustion and fear of what comes next. Across the channel, a distant claimant waits. His name is Henry VII, and his claim is thin, stitched together through inheritance and opportunity. Under different circumstances, it might not matter. In this moment, it matters because the kingdom is ready for anything else. When Henry lands in England in 1485, the response is not universal enthusiasm. It is cautious alignment. Lords hedge. Some join him. Others wait. The memory of reversals is too fresh to commit early. The final confrontation comes at Bosworth Field. The battle itself is decisive but brief. What determines the outcome is not strategy alone, but defection. Key nobles switch sides mid-fight. Richard III is killed, fighting on foot, his crown said to have been lost in the chaos. For you, the aftermath is strangely muted. There is no long pursuit of enemies, no prolonged campaign. The war ends not with total annihilation, but with acceptance. Henry is crowned Henry VII. He marries Elizabeth of York, symbolically uniting the rival houses. The gesture is powerful precisely because everyone understands how fragile symbols can be. This one, however, is reinforced by policy. Henry governs cautiously. He limits private armies. He watches the nobility closely. He does not reward ambition easily. Peace, when it comes, feels different from before, not triumphant, restrained, as if the kingdom has learned that too much certainty invites challenge. For ordinary people like you, the changes are gradual. Fewer sudden shifts in authority, fewer reversals. The courts stabilize. Trade resumes with more confidence. Life remains hard, but the specific terror of waking to a new ruler has faded. What lingers is memory. The Wars of the Roses are remembered later as dramatic, colorful, filled with named battles and famous betrayals. But living through them was quieter. It was waiting, adjusting, choosing words carefully, watching banners change while fields stayed the same. The greatest damage was not physical, though there was plenty of that. It was psychological. The idea of kingship had been altered permanently. A crown was no longer sacred. It was conditional. It could be argued, seized, undone. That lesson did not disappear with Henry VII. It shaped how future rulers governed and how subjects judged them. If you stand at the edge of a market square years later, watching a proclamation read in a steady voice, you may feel relief, but it is cautious relief. You know now how quickly certainty can unravel. And that knowledge, passed quietly from one generation to the next, becomes one of the true legacies of the war. So as England moves forward under a new dynasty, one question remains, unresolved and persistent. After learning that power can be taken, not inherited, can a kingdom ever fully believe in stability again? Story 3. The Albigensian Crusade, faith turned inward. You live in a place where faith is not questioned because questioning it has never been necessary. Belief is woven into daily routine, into the calendar of feast days, the rhythm of work and rest, the sound of bells that mark time more reliably than any clock. In southern France at the turn of the 13th century, Christianity is not merely a religion. It is the language through which the world makes sense. That is why what follows feels so profoundly unsettling. The land you inhabit, often called Occitania by later historians, is prosperous in a quiet way. Towns like Toulouse, Béziers, and Carcassonne are active centers of trade. Local lords rule with relative independence. Culture here feels different from the north. The language, the poetry, even the tone of devotion. Authority exists, but it is negotiated more often than imposed. Into this environment grows a religious movement that does not look dangerous at first. Its followers call themselves simply good Christians. Others will later call them Cathars. They believe in poverty, in personal purity, in a sharp divide between the spiritual and the material. They distrust the wealth of the church, question the authority of priests, and live simply. Some of their teachers, the perfecti, walk barefoot, refuse meat, and survive on charity. For many ordinary people like you, they seem sincere, calm, convincing. They preach without demanding money. They listen. The church notices. From Rome's perspective, this is not harmless dissent. It is heresy organized, persistent, and spreading. Worse, it is tolerated by local nobles, some of whom protect Cathar preachers out of conviction, others out of convenience. The authority of the church depends on universality. Here, universality is cracking. Efforts at persuasion come first. Preachers are sent south. Debates are held. Condemnations are issued. None of it works. The Cathars do not disappear. In some towns, they become more visible. In 1208, the situation escalates violently when a papal legate is murdered. Responsibility is unclear. Blame is quickly assigned, and with that act, restraint ends. In 1209, Pope Innocent III authorizes a crusade not against Muslims in distant lands, but against Christians at home. This is a new and deeply unsettling development. Crusade language, indulgences, and promises of salvation are turned inward. For you, this changes everything. War justified by faith is no longer far away. It is coming down familiar roads. Armies gather from northern France and beyond, drawn by promises of spiritual reward and quietly material gain. Southern lands are wealthy. Heretics, by definition, have no rights that must be respected. Their property can be seized, their lives forfeited. The crusade does not move cautiously. It does not discriminate carefully. When the crusaders reach Béziers, they demand the surrender of heretics. The town refuses or cannot comply fully. What follows is massacre. Men, women, children, Cathar and Catholic alike. A chronicler later records a phrase attributed to a crusade leader: "Kill them all. God will know his own." Whether it was actually spoken matters less than the fact that it was believable. News spreads quickly. Terror moves faster than armies. Towns scramble to decide how to respond. Some surrender immediately. Others fortify. Some attempt negotiation, hoping faith will protect them. You watch neighbors argue not about doctrine but about survival. Is it safer to flee, to convert publicly, to hide known Cathars, to betray them? Castles become focal points. Sieges drag on. Supplies dwindle. Disease follows. The countryside empties as people abandon exposed farms for walled towns or the hills. The crusade takes on a momentum of its own. Leaders emerge, most notably Simon de Montfort, a man ruthless, disciplined, and convinced of his divine mandate. Under his command, territory is conquered systematically. Local lords are dispossessed. Lands are redistributed to northern nobles loyal to the crusade. For ordinary people, this is not a war of ideas. It is a war of occupation. New rulers impose new laws, new customs, new expectations of obedience. Familiar authorities vanish or are executed. The social order is rearranged violently. Faith itself becomes dangerous. Words are weighed carefully. Public rituals are observed meticulously, not always out of devotion but out of fear. A careless remark can be fatal. Association becomes incriminating. You learn to separate private belief from public performance. What makes this conflict especially terrifying is its intimacy. The enemy is not foreign. It is your neighbor, your cousin, the woman who once shared bread with you. Accusation is enough to destroy a life. And yet, the war does not end quickly. It drags on for decades, shifting from open slaughter to systematic repression. What cannot be eradicated by armies will later be hunted by institutions. But for now, in these early years, the violence is blunt and overwhelming. Towns fall. Resistance collapses unevenly. The South is transformed not just politically, but spiritually. As the crusade advances, one realization settles heavily over daily life. Belief, once a personal matter, has become a liability. And as you listen to sermons preached by unfamiliar voices, enforced by unfamiliar swords, one unsettling question takes shape. If faith can justify the destruction of an entire people, what safety is there in believing anything at all? After the first waves of violence, what settles over the land is not shock, but routine. Terror, once sudden, becomes procedural. You begin to understand that the crusade is not only an army moving south, it is a system learning how to sustain itself. The massacres do not stop immediately, but they become less chaotic. Siege replaces slaughter. Administration follows conquest. What was once justified as righteous fury begins to look more like governance, though it is governance built on exclusion. Castles dominate this phase of the war, not the symbolic kind but practical strongholds perched on hills, guarding valleys and roads. Whoever holds them controls movement, taxation, and survival. The Crusaders understand this well. They do not rush blindly. They surround, starve, wait. If you are trapped inside a besieged town, time becomes your enemy. Supplies shrink predictably, wells foul. Disease spreads quietly before it announces itself. Hunger alters priorities. People argue not about theology, but about who gets the last loaf of bread. Outside the walls, the besiegers live off the land. If you farm nearby, neutrality offers no protection. Your grain is seized to feed the army. Your animals are driven away. Resistance is pointless. The war has already decided that your suffering is acceptable. Leadership during this period becomes increasingly centralized under figures like Simon de Montfort. He is not merely a warrior, but an organizer. Lands taken from defeated southern lords are redistributed systematically. New rulers arrive with northern customs and little understanding of local life. This is not just conquest, it is replacement. The social order you once knew dissolves. Old families disappear. New ones take their place. Legal traditions shift. Language in courts changes. Even measures and weights feel unfamiliar. Power no longer negotiates, it dictates. Religious life contracts under scrutiny. Attendance at Mass becomes mandatory in spirit as well as practice. Confession is watched. Associations are remembered. You learn that the safest belief is the one most loudly displayed. Yet even public conformity is not always enough. Accusation becomes a weapon. Personal grudges dress themselves in religious language. If someone envies your land, resents your family, or fears your independence, there is now a vocabulary available to remove you. All it takes is suspicion. This is where the crusade evolves into something more enduring and more insidious. Armies can destroy towns, but they cannot eliminate ideas. For that, a different tool is needed. Out of this necessity emerges the institutional response later known as the medieval Inquisition. It does not arrive all at once. It grows gradually, justified as a means of investigation rather than punishment. Its stated purpose is clarity, to identify heresy, to correct it, to save souls. In practice, it formalizes fear. Inquisitors travel from town to town asking questions that have no safe answers. Who do you associate with? Who visited your home? Who did you hear preach? Silence looks like guilt. Memory becomes dangerous. Forgetting is suspicious. You are encouraged to confess not just your own deviations, but others. This is framed as mercy. Cooperation can reduce punishment. Resistance hardens it. Communities fracture under the pressure. Trust erodes. Punishments vary. Some are public and severe. Imprisonment, execution. Others are quieter. Confiscation of property, enforced penance, social isolation. Even those spared death may lose everything that makes life recognizable. The violence of this phase is less visible than the massacres, but no less effective. It seeps into daily decisions. You learn to avoid certain paths, certain people, certain topics. Faith, once shared openly, retreats inward. Meanwhile, the military campaign grinds on. Some Cathar strongholds hold out for years, perched on remote cliffs. Their endurance becomes symbolic, though it offers little practical relief to those below. Each fall is announced with ceremony, reinforcing the inevitability of defeat. The southern nobility attempts resistance through alliances, legal appeals, even appeals to the crown of France. But the crusade has already altered the balance of power. What was once a regional dispute now serves royal ambition. The French monarchy benefits from the weakening of southern autonomy. For you, this political shift is distant but consequential. Authority becomes more uniform, less negotiable. The flexibility that once characterized local rule disappears. In its place is a hierarchy reinforced by force and sanctified by faith. Years pass. Children grow up knowing only this tightened world. They learn caution before curiosity. They absorb the lesson that belief is safest when unexamined or at least unspoken. The Cathar movement fades, not because it is disproven, but because it is hunted beyond endurance. Its remnants survive in whispers, in memory, in the habits of people who no longer dare to explain why they do what they do. What remains is a transformed society, more centralized, more suspicious, more controlled. The crusade has succeeded not only in suppressing heresy but in redefining obedience. As you move through a town now governed by new laws and watched by new eyes, you may notice how quiet it has become. Not peaceful quiet, but careful quiet. The sound of people choosing words slowly. And beneath that quiet lies an unresolved tension, one that has not yet fully revealed its consequences. When fear becomes the foundation of faith, what kind of belief can possibly survive? By the time the last Cathar strongholds fall, the war no longer feels like a war. There are no great armies marching, no dramatic proclamations of victory that reach every village. Instead, there is a quiet certainty that resistance has ended not because it was defeated in battle, but because it has been made impossible to sustain. If you are still living in the South by this point, you inhabit a land that looks familiar but feels altered. Towns still stand, fields are still worked, bells still ring. Yet almost everything that once gave the region its distinct character has been narrowed, disciplined, or erased. The final symbolic end comes with the fall of Montségur in 1244. Perched high on a rocky outcrop, it had become a refuge for remaining Cathar believers. Its defenders know, long before the siege ends, what surrender will mean. When the fortress finally falls, those who refuse to recant are burned en masse. The act is meant to be conclusive, a warning written in fire. After this, Catharism effectively disappears as an organized movement. There are no more open preachers, no more protected communities. Whatever belief survives does so invisibly, folded into private conscience where it can no longer be identified or destroyed. For you, this does not bring relief, it brings adjustment. The machinery that was built to find heresy does not dismantle itself. The medieval Inquisition remains, refining its procedures, extending its reach. Its focus shifts, but its presence is constant. Fear has proven useful. It will not be abandoned. Religious life becomes more uniform but also more performative. Orthodoxy is not assumed, it is demonstrated. Attendance, confession, public penance, all become visible markers of safety. Faith is no longer just belief, it is compliance. You learn what not to remember. Stories once told openly are forgotten deliberately. Names are avoided. Family histories are shortened. Silence becomes a form of inheritance, passed from parent to child not through instruction, but through example. The political consequences of the crusade become clearer with time. Southern lords who survived do so diminished. Their lands are subject to closer royal oversight. The French crown, once distant, now asserts itself directly. Taxes are standardized. Law becomes less local. This centralization brings a kind of stability. Roads improve, trade becomes more predictable, disputes are settled more consistently, but it is stability achieved through loss of autonomy, and you feel that loss even if you cannot articulate it. Cultural change follows political change. The local language retreats from official use. Poetry fades from courts. Customs once tolerated are discouraged. Identity narrows. If you are old enough to remember the time before the crusade, the contrast is painful. If you are young, you never notice what is missing. You grow up believing this tighter, quieter world is simply how things are. The church, too, has been transformed. It has learned that persuasion is not always sufficient and that institutions can reach where armies cannot. Future conflicts will borrow these lessons. Heresy will never again be treated as merely an error of thought. It will be treated as a threat to order itself. In this sense, the Albigensian Crusade does not end in the 13th century. Its methods echo forward into later inquisitions, later persecutions, later definitions of acceptable belief. The idea that unity must be enforced becomes embedded in European governance. For ordinary people like you, the legacy is quieter but enduring. You have learned to separate inner life from outer expression, to survive by discretion, to understand that truth, when spoken aloud, carries risk. And yet something human persists beneath all of this. People still form attachments. They still hope. They still believe, though belief now wears disguises. It hides in habit, in small acts of kindness, in unspoken values passed carefully between generations. The Crusade succeeded in eliminating a doctrine. It failed to eliminate the human need for meaning beyond authority. If you stand now in a rebuilt town, watching officials record names and obligations with practiced efficiency, you may feel the weight of order pressing down where freedom once lived. You may also feel safer than before. And that tension, the trade between safety and silence, is the true aftermath of the Crusade. Because long after the fires burned out and the last heretic was named, one question remained, unresolved and uncomfortably modern. When obedience brings peace, but at the cost of conscience, how do ordinary people decide what faith is still worth holding? Story 4. The Scottish Wars of Independence, Survival at the Edge of Empire. You live in a place where the land itself teaches caution. The soil is thin in places, the weather unreliable, and the distance between settlements long enough that help rarely arrives quickly. In medieval Scotland, survival is already a skill learned early. When war comes, it does not replace daily hardship, it layers itself on top of it. At the end of the 13th century, Scotland is a kingdom under strain, though not yet under occupation. Its rulers have long balanced independence with pragmatism, negotiating carefully with the far larger and wealthier neighbor to the south. England looms not just as a rival, but as a constant presence economically, militarily, politically. The crisis begins not with invasion, but with absence. In 1290, the Scottish royal line fractures when the young queen dies unexpectedly, leaving no clear adult heir. What follows is not chaos at first, but deliberation. Competing nobles put forward claims. Lawyers argue lineage. Councils meet. For a time, it seems like a legal problem might remain just that. But legal problems invite arbitrators, and arbitrators bring leverage. Into this dispute steps Edward I, ruler of England. He is experienced, forceful, and deeply confident in his authority. He agrees to arbitrate Scotland's succession, but only after the Scottish nobles acknowledge him as their feudal superior. For many, this feels like a formality, words exchanged for stability, a temporary concession to avoid civil war. It does not feel temporary for long. Edward selects a King John Balliol but treats him not as a partner but as a subordinate. Decisions are overridden. Appeals are heard in English courts. Scottish autonomy erodes quietly, case by case. If you are an ordinary person living through this, The shift is subtle but unsettling. Laws you thought local now reference distant authority. Taxes feel heavier. Officials speak with unfamiliar accents. The sense of being governed with begins to feel like being governed over. Resistance builds unevenly. Some nobles comply, others resent. Balliol himself wavers, caught between obligation and humiliation. Eventually, Scotland attempts to assert independence by forming alliances against England. Edward responds not with negotiation, but with force. The invasion of 1296 is swift and brutal. Towns fall. Resistance collapses quickly in some places, more stubbornly in others. Berwick is sacked with extreme violence, sending a clear message. This is not a war of correction. It is a war of dominance. Edward removes Balliol from the throne, taking symbols of Scottish kingship south as trophies. Scotland, as a kingdom, is effectively dismantled. For you, this is not the end of life, it is the beginning of adjustment. English garrisons appear in castles. New officials enforce new rules. Oaths are demanded. Compliance is rewarded with survival. Defiance is punished visibly. Yet occupation does not produce silence. It produces friction. Across the countryside, resistance forms in fragments. Not armies at first, but local uprisings, ambushes, refusals to cooperate. These acts are risky. They depend on terrain, timing, and secrecy. The land itself becomes an ally: hills, forests, narrow passes. Out of this environment emerges a figure later wrapped in legend: William Wallace. In life, he is not yet the myth. He is a man shaped by grievance and opportunity, operating on the margins of authority. Wallace's early actions are small in scale but symbolic. He targets officials. He disrupts supply lines. He avoids direct confrontation when possible. His success lies not in overwhelming force, but in unpredictability. For people like you, this kind of resistance is both inspiring and dangerous. It suggests that English control is not absolute, but it also invites retaliation. When garrisons are attacked, villages are punished. The price of defiance is often paid by those least able to afford it. As the resistance grows, it begins to coordinate. Scottish nobles, long divided by rivalry, see opportunity in unity. Wallace, despite his low noble status, becomes a focal point, not because he is universally trusted, but because he is active when others hesitate. In 1297, the Scots achieve a significant victory at Stirling Bridge. It is a rare moment where terrain, timing, and leadership align. English forces are defeated decisively, not by superior numbers, but by exploiting movement and overconfidence. The victory electrifies Scotland. It proves that resistance is not futile. Wallace is named guardian of the realm, ruling in the name of the absent king. But victory brings visibility, and visibility brings danger. Edward I does not tolerate embarrassment. He prepares personally to crush the uprising. The following year, the English army meets the Scots at Falkirk. This time, the terrain favors England. The result is catastrophic for the Scots. Wallace's forces are broken. He escapes, but the momentum is lost. For you, the pattern is becoming familiar. Hope rises, then is cut down. Resistance wins moments, not conclusions. The cost of each attempt is measured in burned fields, hanged men, and long winters without stores. Wallace fades from leadership, eventually captured and executed brutally in London. His death is meant to be a warning. It does not end the war. Instead, it reveals something essential. This conflict will not be decided quickly, or cleanly, or by a single hero. It is a war of endurance between an empire that can project force and a people who know the land and have nowhere else to go. As English authority tightens again and Scottish resistance regroups quietly, you sense that the struggle has only entered a new phase, one less visible, more calculating, more patient. And as rumors spread of another noble weighing his options, one with royal blood, and a complicated past, you are left with a difficult question. In a war where survival depends on choosing the right moment to resist, how do you know when patience becomes surrender? After the catastrophic defeat at Falkirk, the pattern of the Scottish Wars of Independence changes. Open battle, once a possibility, becomes increasingly rare. The English still control the castles, the towns, and the major roads, but the countryside becomes a different kind of battlefield, one defined by patience, stealth, and endurance. For you, this is the war you live through. It is quieter than battlefields like Falkirk or Stirling, but it is constant. Every day carries risk. Travelers vanish on narrow passes. Fields are burned in reprisal for actions you may not even know were committed. Laws from the English administration arrive with threats as a silent undertone: comply or suffer. The Scottish resistance adapts. Outnumbered and out-equipped, they rely on mobility and local knowledge. Armies fragment into small groups, striking swiftly, disappearing before retaliation can coalesce. Villages support them, but this is always a calculated risk. Providing shelter to a group of rebels is survival for the rebels and potential death for the village. Leadership during this period is decentralized. Robert the Bruce emerges quietly. At first, he is a minor figure among nobles, learning the lessons of failure and patience. He does not command large armies yet, but he understands strategy differently from the English. He knows that dominance is not imposed only by force, it is imposed by endurance, by winning loyalty, by controlling the narrative of authority in the eyes of the people. You witness these dynamics in smaller ways. Supplies move differently. Villages prepare for sudden raids. Message runners carry coded information. Priests, too, are cautious, preaching loyalty to Scotland but avoiding words that might be construed as incitement. The English respond as they always do, with overwhelming force where they can, with intimidation where they cannot. Castles are garrisoned more heavily. Taxes are increased. Public executions remind the population who holds authority. Every act of resistance is answered not just with direct military action, but with indirect punishment aimed at the civilian population. This is how the war teaches you patience and fear simultaneously. Survival is not about winning the day. It is about lasting long enough for the enemy to exhaust themselves. It is about learning when to hide, when to speak, when to act, and when to wait. Robert the Bruce himself is forced into exile several times. He loses family lands, battles rival claimants among the Scots, and endures political isolation. Yet each setback teaches him and the people around him lessons that will later prove decisive. Leadership is not a matter of immediate victory, but of sustained adaptability. During these years, alliances are fragile. A neighboring lord might support the Bruce today, but shift allegiance tomorrow if the English offer incentives or threaten destruction. Trust is local and temporal. Long-term loyalty is rare, except among those who have learned that survival depends more on shared danger than on abstract principles. The English army remains powerful, but its influence diminishes when confronted with a population that knows the terrain. Ambushes and raids prevent supply lines from remaining reliable. Small, mobile forces disrupt communication and erode morale. The war is no longer fought by grand tactics on wide plains, it is fought in forests, hills, and hidden valleys where maps and cavalry matter less than cunning and endurance. For ordinary people, the cost is often invisible but profound. Fields are abandoned, livestock taken, families displaced. Villagers live in a continuous state of calculation, weighing the risk of helping the resistance against the certainty of punishment if caught. Every choice carries consequences beyond your household, extending to your neighbors and kin. Yet hope persists. Stories of successful raids, small victories, and the survival of noble leaders inspire ordinary people. Even without fully understanding the broader political strategy, you can sense that persistence matters. That resistance, even at the smallest scale, is meaningful. As the years stretch on, the war becomes less about immediate conquest and more about shaping identity. Being Scottish comes to mean endurance, cunning, and loyalty to the idea of autonomy, even when the practical mechanisms of control are absent. Cultural memory solidifies in the midst of hardship. Songs are sung, tales are whispered, and the collective understanding of defiance passes from one generation to the next. And yet, as Robert the Bruce quietly rebuilds his base, gathers allies, and waits for the right moment to strike, you understand something fundamental about this war. It is defined not by grand battles alone, but by the quiet calculus of survival. The land itself teaches strategy. The people themselves become instruments of resistance. Power is not absolute, it is negotiated daily, subtly, and often invisibly. By 1306, Robert the Bruce takes decisive action, murdering a rival to consolidate power and declaring himself King of Scots. This bold move ignites a new phase of the war, one that is more centralized in leadership but still reliant on local participation and guerrilla tactics. England, for all its resources, is now confronting a conflict that cannot be resolved through brute force alone. And as you watch, year after year, the slow ebb and flow of these campaigns, one thought settles uncomfortably in your mind. In a conflict where every day demands vigilance, and every action carries hidden consequences, how can ordinary people know whether endurance is bravery or simply the cost of surviving someone else's war? By 1314, the Scottish Wars of Independence have reached a turning point that seems improbable to anyone who has endured the previous decade. England, confident in its supremacy, has invested heavily in garrisons, roads, and fortifications, expecting that the rebellion will be snuffed out. Instead, the war proves to be patient, cunning, and deeply rooted in the land itself. The key moment comes at the Battle of Bannockburn, where Robert the Bruce leads a relatively small Scottish force against Edward II's much larger army. You might expect that numbers alone would determine the outcome. You would be wrong. The Scottish army exploits every hill, ditch, and narrow pass, forcing the English cavalry into disadvantage. Spears and terrain, disciplined soldiers, and local knowledge disrupt what should have been a straightforward conquest. For you, watching or hearing about this victory is both thrilling and frightening. Thrilling because it demonstrates that resilience can matter more than wealth or size. Frightening because it comes after years of uncertainty. What if the English had won? What if your village had been destroyed as punishment for resistance? The stakes of survival have always been high, but the demonstration that victory is possible reshapes perception. After Bannockburn, Robert consolidates power, but the war is far from over. England retains claims, launches raids, and presses economically where it cannot militarily. Scottish nobles remain divided in loyalty, some pragmatic, others opportunistic. Every day requires negotiation, vigilance, and sometimes violence. Authority is still contested. For ordinary people, life adjusts slowly. Castles return to Scottish hands, but administration is imperfect. Local lords enforce their authority, often harshly, and the king's influence is mediated through these intermediaries. Taxes are collected, sometimes fairly, sometimes punitively. Peace is present, but it is conditional, fragile, and dependent on loyalty and compliance. One lesson becomes painfully clear. Survival in Scotland is less about allegiance to a crown than about reading the local and regional balance of power. Helping a noble today may save your family. Refusing tomorrow may save your honor. Risk is constant. Memory matters. Reputation is currency. This is how ordinary people navigate centuries-long instability. The war also shapes Scottish identity profoundly. Centuries of endurance, defiance, and adaptability transformed Scotland from a collection of feuding territories into a kingdom with a shared sense of resilience. The collective memory of resistance becomes part of daily life. Festivals celebrate victories, songs recount daring raids, and even cautionary tales remind children that survival sometimes depends on discretion rather than bravery. The English, for their part, gradually adjust expectations. They realize that imposing authority over a population willing to endure and adapt is costly, slow, and uncertain. Repeated attempts at domination leave scars economic, military, and psychological. Scotland's resistance is not romantic. It is methodical. It is persistence. By the end of Robert the Bruce's reign, Scotland is more cohesive politically than it had been at the start of the wars. Borders are better defined, authority more centralized, and the monarchy strengthened, but these achievements come at a cost. Communities bear the memory of depopulated villages, scorched fields, and disrupted trade. Nobles bear the weight of loyalty tested repeatedly. The ordinary people carry both the resilience of survival and the quiet trauma of constant threat. For you, the story of the Scottish Wars of Independence is therefore double-edged. It is a testament to courage, ingenuity, and endurance. It is also a reminder that victory in war is rarely absolute, and that survival often demands compromises that feel like small defeats. The conflict also leaves an enduring lesson for future generations. Power is never secure merely because it is commanded. Legitimacy is fragile, and control is as much about perception, geography, and endurance as it is about military strength. Kings can be dethroned. Armies can be routed. But the land and its people, when prepared to endure, cannot be easily conquered. Standing centuries later in a quiet glen or beside a restored castle, you might marvel at the peace that seems natural. Yet, beneath that peace lies a history of patience, cunning, and survival. Scotland's story is not one of decisive, singular battles, but of enduring struggle, shaped not only by kings and generals, but by the countless ordinary people who navigated the hazards of war every day. And as you reflect on these years, one final, sobering question lingers. If survival is achieved by constant vigilance and adaptation, how much of life is truly free, and how much is shaped by the invisible pressures of war? Story 5. The 100 Years' War, Endless Siege and Stubborn Resolve. You wake each day to the sounds of the countryside birds, livestock, distant church bells, but they do not reassure you. For over a century, your homeland has been a battleground in a war that seems to have no clear beginning, no final aim, and no end. This is the 100 Years' War, though it lasts longer than the name suggests, stretching from 1337 to 1453, shaping life in subtle, relentless ways. The conflict begins not with massive armies at first, but with a dispute over succession. The French crown, like many medieval institutions, is vulnerable to contested inheritance. When the French king dies without a male heir, English rulers assert claims, arguing that bloodlines give them rights across the Channel. To the English king, war is not a choice but a duty, both legal and economic. To the French, resistance is instinct, because the alternative is occupation by a foreign ruler. You, an ordinary villager, do not debate legitimacy. You debate survival. Taxes rise to fund armies. Soldiers pass through your village, often taking what they need, whether by legal demand or by simple force. Roads are dangerous. Markets shrink. The rhythm of planting and harvesting is disrupted repeatedly by the march of men in armor. In the early decades, English forces score notable successes, capturing key towns and fortresses, and winning battles like Crécy in 1346. Their longbowmen, ordinary men trained to deadly effect, prove that even lightly armored infantry can shape the outcome of history. The French knights, heavily armored and proud of tradition, falter under new tactics and sustained campaigns. For you, the distinction between heroism and cruelty blurs. Each soldier's skill may save a life or end one, depending on proximity and luck. The war's defining feature is not total conquest but attrition. Sieges dominate the landscape. Towns are enclosed by walls, filled with anxious citizens who know that starvation can be as deadly as the enemy's sword. Grain rots or is burned, wells are poisoned, and disease follows closely behind hunger. You learn to calculate survival, how many days your stored food will last, how quickly your neighbors will be forced to surrender, how best to conceal livestock or valuables. For French peasants, The English occupation is variable. Some local lords negotiate to maintain authority under foreign oversight, extracting tribute while preserving limited self-governance. Others resist, at enormous personal risk. The choice between collaboration and defiance is never straightforward. Helping a soldier may save your family one week and invite punishment the next. Across this turbulent landscape, new tactics and innovations emerge. The longbow, cannon, and mobile infantry slowly shift the balance of power. Cities fortify more aggressively. Supply lines are stretched across hundreds of miles. Ordinary people, who once only worried about weather and disease, now worry about logistics, where the army will camp, where supplies are stored, and how rumors of approaching forces can mean sudden displacement. The social consequences are profound. Trade diminishes, famine strikes repeatedly, and population declines due to both war and the plague that spreads alongside it. Families adapt by keeping fewer possessions, storing food strategically, and teaching children to recognize the signs of approaching danger. Survival becomes the primary education. Despite these hardships, culture and identity persist. French citizens retain language, customs, and allegiance to local lords or the crown, even under intermittent English occupation. Patriotism, religious devotion, and loyalty become intertwined with necessity. Songs, stories, and oral traditions recount both heroism and betrayal. These narratives are practical as well as symbolic. They guide how people act, showing which strategies, flight, negotiation, or concealment, are most likely to succeed. As decades pass, the war becomes cyclical. English kings send armies, French lords raise forces in response, and the countryside endures yet another siege. You learn that time itself can be a weapon. Prolonged conflict drains resources, weakens authority, and forces compromises you may not understand. Political outcomes rarely match the scale of suffering experienced by ordinary people. Amid this chaos, notable figures emerge. Joan of Arc will later become a symbol of resistance, rallying French forces to reclaim territories captured by England. At this point in Section 1, however, her birth is decades away. What you see instead are long decades of uncertainty, punctuated by raids, sieges, and the slow erosion of stability. For those living near contested regions, the war never leaves. It becomes background, a constant pressure shaping decisions large and small. Marriage arrangements, inheritance, and property disputes all carry new weight because the military and political landscape is unpredictable. Ordinary decisions, like planting crops or storing grain, are now influenced by the likelihood of occupation, pillage, or conscription. And yet, amidst this grinding attrition, human resilience shines in subtle ways. Villages rebuild, often multiple times. Farmers cultivate new fields when old ones are lost. Merchants adapt supply chains. Communities form local agreements to protect each other, to warn of approaching soldiers, and to maintain morale. Life continues not despite the war, but alongside it, in careful, deliberate, measured steps. As you hear news of battles far away, sometimes victorious for one side, sometimes the other, a persistent, unsettling question remains. If a war can last generations, touching every life without end, how does ordinary existence find its own measure of stability? By the mid-14th century, the 100 Years' War has transformed the landscape of northern France into a patchwork of contested territories. Cities, towns, and villages are caught between warring kings, each with an army, each demanding loyalty, tribute, and labor. For you, life is no longer dictated by the seasons alone, it is dictated by the unpredictable movements of soldiers, the shifting allegiances of local lords, and the slow, grinding attrition of protracted war. The era of open battles has passed. While confrontations like Crécy and Poitiers are still remembered, their lessons reverberate long after. Armies cannot sustain themselves indefinitely in enemy territory. They rely on local provisions, and those provisions often come at a cost: confiscation, requisition, or destruction. Villages learn quickly that survival often depends on cooperation, or at least the appearance of it. Castles dominate this phase of the war, not just as military strongholds, but as instruments of control over both territory and populace. You learn that the approach of a besieging army does not just threaten lives, it threatens the entire economy of a village. If your local castle falls, the garrison may be replaced by occupiers who tax mercilessly, burn surrounding farms, and demand labor or loyalty. Resistance is dangerous. Accommodation is costly, but surrender can be fatal if the conqueror deems compliance insufficient. The siege itself is a slow, deliberate machine. Armies cut off water and food, build fortifications around towns, and wait for inhabitants to exhaust themselves. Disease spreads inevitably, carried by malnourished civilians and crowded conditions. For you, time becomes measured in the decay of grain, the dwindling of livestock, and the endurance of children. Each day is a calculation. How long before surrender is forced? How long before someone desperate breaks the rules? How long before outsiders decide that your village is expendable? Meanwhile, taxation and levies extract a constant toll. Lords from both sides demand contributions, sometimes simultaneously. Men may be conscripted for long marches or garrison duty, leaving fields untended and stores unharvested. Women take over responsibilities for work and defense, balancing survival against the ever-present threat of violence. Every ordinary act, cooking, repairing, trading, carries a shadow of military oversight. Amid this, the war creates pockets of opportunity. Mercenary companies roam the countryside, sometimes extorting locals, sometimes offering protection to those who can pay. Cities with walls and wealth may negotiate terms with one army or another, buying temporary peace with money, goods, or hostages. Small acts of strategy, hiding grain, alerting allies, feigning loyalty, become survival tactics. Intelligence, rumor, and local knowledge are as powerful as any sword. Religion is not untouched by the war. Churches are both sanctuaries and targets. Clerics mediate, preach obedience, or assist in rationing. But the moral authority of the church is complicated by the constant presence of armies. Public piety becomes a tool for survival, not just belief. You may pray not for salvation alone, but to avert suspicion, to avoid conscription, to survive the gaze of a passing soldier. Over decades, the human toll is staggering. Chroniclers speak in numbers, but you feel it in memory. Friends vanish, families are displaced, neighbors die quietly of starvation or disease. Social bonds are strained. Communities fracture, only to recombine with new leaders or returning exiles. Life becomes a careful navigation of uncertainty. Yet even amid hardship, resilience emerges. Towns rebuild walls stronger than before. Merchants reroute trade around contested regions. Farmers learn the cycles of raiding and occupation, timing planting and harvest with careful observation of troop movements. Folk stories spread lessons, warning children about approaching soldiers or teaching secret signs of loyalty and resistance. Survival itself becomes a communal art. Amid the chaos, figures like Edward III and Philip VI dominate headlines, but your life is shaped more by the local than the royal. How a village responds to siege, which noble intervenes, which road is safe, these are the choices that define your daily existence. Strategy and survival intersect in ways invisible to kings, yet deadly in practice. You also see the war teach harsh lessons about endurance. Occupation becomes a normalized condition. Fear becomes habitual. Patience is not a virtue but a necessity. Communities develop codes: when to flee, when to submit, when to resist quietly. Every act of adaptation is a small victory against an omnipresent threat. As the war drags on into the 15th century, these conditions become entrenched. Villages, towns, and regions adapt to a reality in which the state of war is perpetual. Siegecraft, taxation, forced labor, and pillage are as normal as seasonal planting. Victory and defeat are experienced locally, in real time, long before proclamations reach distant courts. And yet, human resilience never fully fades. Ordinary people continue to plant, trade, pray, and celebrate life where possible. Survival is measured not in grand victories, but in the ability to endure another winter, to see another spring, to preserve family and home despite the grinding pressures of decades-long conflict. And as the centuries-long struggle grinds on, one question becomes unavoidable. If ordinary life persists through a war that seems endless, does survival itself become the only measure of victory? By the mid-15th century, the 100 Years' War begins to shift from relentless campaigning to a cautious, protracted stalemate. Generations of French and English have now grown up under the weight of continuous conflict, and the land itself bears the scars. Abandoned villages, eroded farmland, and cities whose walls were repeatedly battered and rebuilt. For ordinary people like you, the war is no longer a series of battles to witness, but a persistent condition to endure. During this final phase, the tide gradually turns in favor of France. The emergence of Joan of Arc electrifies French resistance. She is a figure both extraordinary and improbable, a young woman claiming divine guidance, rallying demoralized troops, and leading campaigns to reclaim territories lost to the English. Her victories at Orleans in 1429 inspire hope where none had existed for decades, reminding both soldiers and civilians that momentum can shift even in an entrenched, grinding war. Yet her story is also a cautionary tale. Captured by the Burgundians and handed to the English, Joan is tried for heresy and executed in 1431. Her death demonstrates the cruelty and complexity of this war. Triumph can be fleeting and survival uncertain. For ordinary people, the lesson is clear. Heroism exists, but so does the relentless machinery of politics, vengeance, and occupation. Meanwhile, France consolidates control over reclaimed lands. Local lords who had switched allegiance to survive now return to the crown's service. English-held towns and fortresses are gradually retaken, not through one decisive battle, but by coordinated campaigns that combine military force, sieges, diplomacy, and negotiation. For you, the return of French authority may feel stabilizing, but it comes with its own costs. New taxes, the reassertion of legal authority, and the slow recovery from decades of disrupted life. The economic and social impact is profound. Decades of conflict have disrupted trade, depopulated villages, and caused famine in some regions. Families have been fractured. Fields lie fallow. Rebuilding is slow, deliberate, and often improvisational. Ordinary people learn to manage scarcity, protect their livelihoods, and preserve memory. Stories of occupation, resistance, and survival become embedded in local culture. The war shapes not only politics, but the habits and psychology of generations. Militarily, the war evolves. Traditional mounted knights and large-scale cavalry charges give way to infantry, artillery, and longbows. Sieges dominate campaigns, emphasizing patience, supply lines, and attrition. Armies rely more on professional soldiers than levies drawn from local populations. For you, this means that the daily impact is both indirect and pervasive. Requisitioned food, movement restrictions, conscription, and the threat of raiding remain constant, even when the largest battles occur far away. By 1453, the English retain only Calais on French soil. The formal conclusion of the war is less a triumph than a recognition of exhaustion. Both kingdoms are impoverished, populations depleted, and local governance fractured. Yet the war leaves behind a more cohesive France, a resilient society, and a hardened England that begins to turn attention elsewhere. For ordinary people, peace is not instant relief. It is a process of rebuilding, adaptation, and cautious optimism. Throughout these years, the lessons of the war are encoded into daily life. Patience, endurance, and prudence become as vital as farming or trade skills. Ordinary people understand the fragility of authority, the impermanence of victory, and the necessity of adaptation. Survival is measured not by land gained or lost, but by the continuity of family, community, and tradition through decades of upheaval. Even as life returns to something resembling normalcy, the memory of the war lingers. Tales of heroism, betrayal, and tragedy are told in whispers and songs. Survivors carry scars, physical, economic, and emotional, that influence their choices for decades. The war reshapes identity at every level: national, local, and personal. And yet, amid the ruins and the recovery, human resilience endures. Farmers tend their fields, merchants rebuild trade networks, families reconstitute households, and children grow up learning both the horror of the past and the necessity of survival. The 100 Years' War may have been long, destructive, and seemingly endless, but it also demonstrates the extraordinary capacity of ordinary people to endure, adapt, and rebuild. As you reflect on these years, one final, unsettling thought remains. When a war can last generations, shaping every action and every choice, how do people reclaim the ordinary rhythms of life? And is normalcy ever fully restored after a century of conflict? Story 6. The Fall of Constantinople, when walls could not hold. You live in a city that has endured more than 1,000 years of siege, revolt, and survival. Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, sits at the crossroads of continents, where Europe and Asia meet at the waters of the Bosporus. Its walls, famed for their height and strength, have repelled countless attackers. Its streets are filled with merchants, artisans, and scholars, a network of life sustained by trade, religion, and centuries of tradition. To live here is to inhabit a place that feels eternal, but eternal cities have weaknesses, as you are about to learn. By the mid-15th century, the Byzantine Empire is a shadow of its former glory. Once a vast dominion stretching across the Mediterranean, it is now a handful of provinces clustered around Constantinople itself. Resources are scarce. Nobles squabble. The emperor relies heavily on diplomacy and favors from Western Europe, which is often slow, distracted, or unwilling to help. You see the vulnerability everywhere: in crumbling walls, in unpaid soldiers, in empty granaries. In 1453, that vulnerability becomes a stark reality. Maimed II ascends to the Ottoman throne. A young, ambitious, and determined ruler, he sees Constantinople not merely as a prize, but as the key to completing his empire. For him, the city is the ultimate symbol. Capture it, and the centuries of Byzantine prestige and strategic advantage fall into Ottoman hands. For you, it is the horizon of fear. The Ottomans gather a massive force. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of soldiers, equipped with siege engines, artillery, and trained engineers. They arrive on the outskirts of the city, their ships filling the Golden Horn, their banners fluttering over the hills. For the citizens, it is overwhelming, a seemingly unstoppable tide surrounding their home. Rumors spread quickly, some hopeful, some despairing. You weigh every rumor, every sighting of a scout, every sound of distant cannon fire. Panic exists quietly alongside routine. Trade, food, and work continue in tense bursts, punctuated by the reality of the encroaching army. Defending the city is Constantine XI Palaiologos, a ruler whose reputation is both courageous and tragic. He organizes the defenders, numbering only a few thousand compared to Maime's tens of thousands. Soldiers are reinforced by citizen volunteers, artisans, and even monks. They fortify the massive Theodosian walls, repair towers, and place chain booms across the harbor to prevent Ottoman ships from entering the Golden Horn. Every stone you lift, every spike you drive, every barricade you construct feels like a delay against inevitability. Yet even the walls, so long regarded as impregnable, are under assault by technology and persistence. The Ottomans employ large cannons, some massive enough to fire stones weighing hundreds of pounds. Each bombardment shakes houses, rattles nerves, and weakens masonry. The psychological weight of continuous attack, the relentless pounding of artillery, and the knowledge that reinforcements may never come, turns survival into a test of endurance. You wake at night to the sound of siege engines, and sleep in short bursts, alert to every distant echo. The city's population is strained further by the presence of refugees from surrounding regions, drawn to the relative safety of Constantinople. Each additional person increases the need for food, water, and shelter, while simultaneously complicating the organization of defenses. Every day is a balancing act. Rations are stretched, hospitals fill, and morale teeters. You learn that survival is not only about walls and weapons, it is about managing scarcity, hope, and fear simultaneously. Political and religious dynamics add layers of tension. Appeals are sent to Western Europe for military assistance. Princes, popes, and mercenaries respond sporadically. Some arrive late, some fail to arrive at all. Faith in distant allies becomes both comforting and dangerous. If help is imagined but does not materialize, despair can follow swiftly. You see leaders arguing about strategy, yet powerless against the mass of the Ottoman army. Every discussion reminds you of the fragility of authority when it lacks resources. In the final weeks, tension reaches its peak. The Ottomans construct massive tunnels, attempt to breach walls with concentrated artillery, and use psychological warfare, feigned retreats, noise, and intimidation. Civilians and soldiers alike experience exhaustion, both physical and mental. Every day spent defending the city is a small victory. Every cannonball that hits a wall, a small terror. And yet, despite the preparation, despite centuries of fortifications, despite the courage of Constantine XI and the defenders, one question looms over every thought, every heartbeat. Can even the mightiest walls withstand time, technology, and the determination of a young empire? The siege of Constantinople begins in earnest on April 6, 1453. For you, life has narrowed to the space inside the city walls, the sound of distant Ottoman drums, and the relentless barrage of cannons shaking the foundations of your home. The city is crowded with soldiers, citizens, and refugees, all of whom must navigate a harsh calculus of survival: food, water, shelter, and the ever-present danger of death. The Ottomans, under maimed II, are methodical. Siege towers advance slowly along the walls. Infantry prepares for assaults. Engineers dig tunnels beneath key towers, intending to collapse walls from below. Artillery hammers relentlessly, reducing centuries-old masonry into rubble. Each explosion sends shockwaves through the city, and every impact deepens the sense that survival is not a matter of courage alone, but of endurance and luck. Inside the walls, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos coordinates a defense that is heroic yet desperate. Soldiers from distant provinces join locals in manning parapets, while volunteers, including teenagers and elderly men, fill gaps wherever manpower is short. Civilians haul stones, repair breaches, and tend the wounded. Every ordinary person becomes a participant in a war they cannot choose to leave. You learn quickly that heroism can be mundane: carrying water under fire, reinforcing a damaged wall, keeping morale alive when fatigue and fear threaten to overwhelm. Food and water become scarce. Supplies that once sustained the population are consumed quickly. Markets shrink. Prices for bread and meat soar. Families ration what they can, and some are forced to make grim choices about who eats first. Disease spreads quietly, carried by exhaustion, hunger, and overcrowding. Death is constant, though often invisible, a quiet companion alongside the thunder of cannons and the clamor of soldiers. The psychological weight of the siege is as significant as the physical threat. Day after day, cannon fire echoes across the city, and rumors circulate about breaches, betrayals, and incoming reinforcements that may never arrive. Children cry, adults grow silent, and despair hangs over homes like smoke from a distant fire. Even small victories, like repelling a scaling party or repairing a wall, provide only temporary relief. You realize that survival in a siege is about measuring risk, conserving strength, and enduring what feels endless. Despite the grim reality, acts of ingenuity emerge. Citizens use chains to block the Golden Horn, preventing Ottoman ships from entering the harbor. Engineers construct countertunnels to collapse enemy mining operations. Archers find vantage points in ruins, making each meter of wall a potential trap for the attackers. the city's defenses become a testament to human adaptation, a complex network where every individual artisan, soldier, or peasant plays a role in maintaining the fragile equilibrium between life and destruction. Yet the Ottomans' persistence is relentless. They rotate troops, repair siege engines, and innovate continuously. Large cannons, some capable of firing 600-pound stones, batter walls indiscriminately. Each bombardment demonstrates that centuries of masonry, skill, and history can be undone by new technology. The psychological terror of this innovation is compounded by the knowledge that help from the West has been inconsistent and insufficient. Appeals to the papacy and foreign monarchs yield some reinforcements, but too few to change the balance decisively. During the siege, small-scale tragedies unfold constantly. Civilians trapped in upper floors of damaged homes fall victim to debris. Fires, set by stray embers or deliberate attacks, consume neighborhoods. Water wells near the walls become contaminated or exhausted. You watch neighbors you've known all your life die quietly of disease or starvation, or vanish in the confusion of bombardment. Every day is a negotiation with fate, a constant reminder that survival is provisional. Morale is both fragile and essential. Emperor Constantine addresses citizens repeatedly, calling for courage and resilience, invoking faith and loyalty. Priests bless the walls, carry messages, and minister to the wounded. Even the smallest act, a candle lit in a church, a loaf of bread shared, becomes a testament to endurance, a small defiance against the inevitability that seems to gather outside the gates. As the siege continues, you begin to understand a central truth. No wall, no matter how tall or thick, can protect a city indefinitely against the combination of time, technology, and relentless determination. Every day, each cannonball, each mining attempt, each exhaustion of resources brings the city closer to a decision it may not be able to influence. Survival depends less on valor and more on endurance, ingenuity, and ultimately luck. And yet, even amidst the fear, exhaustion, and constant danger, one question lingers persistently, pressing on every thought, every heartbeat, every choice. If centuries of walls, wisdom, and human effort cannot hold against persistence and innovation, what truly protects a city and the people within it when history comes to claim it? May 29, 1453, arrives with a quiet that feels almost unnatural. You wake before dawn to the clanging of distant hammers and the low rumble of Ottoman siege engines. For months, the city has been under relentless bombardment, but today there is a sense of inevitability in the air. Walls weakened by cannon fire are breached. Towers that once seemed untouchable crumble. The rhythm of life you clung to, however tenuous, is about to shatter. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos rallies the defenders one last time. Soldiers, artisans, and volunteers man the parapets. Arrows are loosed, boiling oil poured, chains thrown across breaches. You, an ordinary citizen, find yourself helping wherever needed, lifting rubble, carrying water, guiding children to safety. The city is every citizen's responsibility. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, is a form of survival. Maimed II's forces, numbering tens of thousands, press relentlessly. Infantry swarms over breaches, scaling ladders, pushing against walls. Cannons continue to thunder, dislodging stone and scattering debris. Even the bravest defenders cannot cover every point at once. Fear is constant, exhaustion relentless. You notice neighbors' strong men, once so confident, crumble under stress, while quiet, unnoticed individuals act with extraordinary courage, plugging gaps, rescuing wounded, and holding lines no one expected could be held. Despite the chaos, a profound sense of solidarity emerges. People protect one another, share resources, and carry messages between sectors. The city's survival, however temporary, depends on these small acts. Everyday resilience, lifting a fallen soldier, feeding a starving child, reinforcing a gate, becomes as decisive as the clash of swords. You feel, even in panic, the strange dignity of ordinary endurance. By mid-afternoon, the Ottoman forces breach a critical wall. The battle floods the streets. The city becomes a labyrinth of smoke, rubble, and desperate shouts. Civilians flee toward inner sanctuaries, churches, and courtyards, but escape is limited. Death and capture are immediate threats. You run, help others, and pray, knowing that history itself has come to pass over your head. Emperor Constantine disappears in the melee. Accounts vary, some say he fought to the end on the walls, others that he leaped into the crowd, never to be seen again. The loss is not only military but symbolic. The last Byzantine emperor falls alongside the city. His death marks the definitive end of an empire that had endured for more than 1,000 years, leaving behind a fragile population clinging to continuity amidst devastation. For survivors, life is transformed instantaneously. The Ottomans assert authority quickly, reorganizing administration, imposing taxes, and installing garrisons. For ordinary citizens, survival now depends on navigating the new power. Those who comply may retain homes, jobs, and relative safety. Those who resist or are suspected of loyalty to the fallen regime face harsh punishment. The lessons of endurance continue, but now under a different master. Yet the city itself is not erased. Streets are repopulated, markets reopen, trade resumes along the Bosporus, connecting Europe and Asia. Churches are converted, rebuilt, or repurposed. Scholars, artisans, and merchants adapt to Ottoman rule, preserving skills, traditions, and cultural memory even as the political landscape has shifted irreversibly. Survival, it seems, is as much about adaptability as bravery. You notice something profound. History is not solely made by kings, generals, or cannons. It is made by the ordinary, those who endure daily, who adapt quietly, who navigate danger while maintaining the continuity of life. Each loaf of bread rationed, each wall repaired, each prayer whispered amid chaos is a measure of human resilience. Over time, Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, becomes a vibrant Ottoman metropolis, blending traditions from Byzantium, Asia, and the Middle East. You recognize that survival is not simply enduring a single siege, but carrying knowledge, skills, and culture through the disruption of centuries. The city itself, and those who live within it, embody continuity amid change. And yet the haunting question remains, echoing in empty streets and shattered walls. When a city falls despite centuries of preparation, courage, and ingenuity, what is the true measure of its endurance? The stones that held it up, the people who defended it, or the traditions that survived long after the walls crumbled? Story 7. The Wars of the Roses: Kinship, Ambition, and Survival in England. You wake in England in the mid-15th century to a land that feels familiar but is deeply unsettled. The streets of towns and villages carry the same smells of wood smoke, bread, and livestock as always, yet the air is thick with uncertainty. News travels slowly, but when it comes, it speaks of battles hundreds of miles away, of nobles raising armies, and of kings challenged by their own cousins. You quickly learn that your survival is entwined with a war that is both intimate and impersonal: the Wars of the Roses. The conflict begins as a dispute over succession to the English throne, rooted in the rivalry between two branches of the royal Plantagenet family: the House of Lancaster, symbolized by a red rose, and the House of York, marked by a white rose. At first, these are names on paper, badges of allegiance among lords and knights. For you, though, these symbols are warnings. A white rose passing through your town may bring levies for one side, a red rose, conscription for another. The colors dictate more than loyalty, they dictate safety, taxes, and who might visit your village under the guise of protection. King Henry VI of the Lancastrian line rules with a gentle hand and fragile mind, leaving his nobles to maneuver for power. Yorkist challengers, most notably Richard, Duke of York, push claims, exploit mismanagement, and gather support among those who see the king as weak. The aristocracy, fractured and ambitious, draws England into cycles of civil war, rebellion, and uneasy truces. To survive, ordinary people must learn quickly when to pay allegiance, when to hide, when to flee. The first major battles, such as St. Albans in 1455, signal that blood will determine what diplomacy cannot. You may not fight directly, but the consequences reach every village. Taxes rise to fund armies. Soldiers pass through your lands, sometimes taking grain, horses, or livestock without formal payment. Even markets and fairs, usually hubs of relative safety, become dangerous as armed men enforce claims or intimidate civilians. You learn that the world beyond your door can erupt violently with little warning. Civil conflict is personal in unexpected ways. Nobles who had once been patrons may switch allegiances. Neighbors are enlisted into one army or another. Letters, rumors, and warnings arrive sporadically, each carrying potential danger. You might host a soldier today, only to face suspicion tomorrow from those who align differently. Survival is a daily negotiation, balancing loyalty, discretion, and calculation. Ordinary acts, feeding a passing knight, hiding a fleeing noble, or even carrying water for the wounded, can determine whether your household endures or collapses. The war is punctuated by brutality, but also by astonishing pragmatism. Local communities organize militias to defend their lands against marauding soldiers from both sides. Villagers reinforce bridges, clear forests to prevent ambushes, and store food secretly. You notice that survival is not purely about courage in battle, but about foresight, cooperation, and sometimes cold calculation. Knowing when to flee may be as important as knowing when to fight. Meanwhile, nobles exploit the chaos to expand influence and reclaim lands lost to rivals. Alliances are fluid. Marriages, hostages, and promises of loyalty shift the balance subtly and often brutally. One week, your lord may support the Yorkist cause. The next, he pledges to Lancaster. Each change ripples through your life. Fields are plundered, taxes adjusted, and your neighbors' fates are determined by decisions made in distant halls and forests. Religion and ritual offer limited comfort. Priests bless armies, conduct funerals for the fallen, and preach obedience and piety, but they cannot shield ordinary people from swords or famine. Faith becomes practical. Prayers are offered not only for salvation but for survival, for protection against marauders, for the endurance of family and home. You also notice that the human cost extends far beyond death in battle. Hunger, disease, and displacement stalk the population. Villagers live in cycles of repair and loss, rebuilding homes after raids, tending fields left untended when soldiers pass through, and navigating fragmented communities as some neighbors flee and others return. Survival is measured less by victory on the battlefield than by the continuity of daily life. Amid the chaos, moments of adaptation shine through. Small towns create local councils to enforce order in the absence of strong governance. Trade persists in concealed routes. Families hide valuables, sometimes even abandoning homes temporarily to protect people. Knowledge of the land, forests, rivers, hills becomes a weapon as much as any sword. Ordinary life is an act of subtle resistance and ongoing negotiation with the forces that sweep through it. And yet, the larger political stakes loom persistently. The succession crisis that sparked the war is unresolved, and the power struggles of York and Lancaster threaten to engulf the kingdom again and again. You may see one army triumph temporarily, only to hear rumors that the other will return with vengeance. The pattern is cyclical, exhausting, and unpredictable. As you witness, or simply survive, these cycles of violence, displacement, and fragile peace, one thought remains constantly at the back of your mind. When your life is defined by the ambitions of distant cousins and the blood of kings, how do ordinary people preserve continuity, hope, and identity in a world ruled by relentless rivalry? The Wars of the Roses do not confine themselves to battles in fields or castles. They seep into every corner of daily life. For ordinary people, survival is not about wielding a sword or claiming a throne. It is about enduring the slow, pervasive uncertainty that comes when the ambitions of kings and nobles dictate the rhythm of existence. After the first skirmishes, such as the Battle of St. Albans in 1455, the kingdom is never truly at peace. Armies move unpredictably, occupying towns, levying supplies, and sometimes committing acts of violence against civilians. You learn quickly that loyalty is situational. A noble who passes through your village today with a white rose may demand food and horses. The same noble, months later, may retreat and leave Lancastrians to impose their will. Life becomes a delicate negotiation. Compliance ensures survival, defiance can be deadly, and inaction can invite suspicion from both sides. The psychological burden is constant. Families weigh every decision with care. Should a son serve a Yorkist lord to protect property or avoid conscription to preserve life? Should you hide grain, potentially angering occupying forces, or surrender it and risk starvation later? Daily life is punctuated by these choices, each carrying consequences far beyond your household. Civil war also reshapes communities. Markets fluctuate based on who controls the roads. Inns and taverns see soldiers, messengers, and displaced people moving constantly, bringing news, rumors, and threats. Trade adapts to avoid conflict zones. You notice that ordinary survival requires strategic thinking, navigating which routes are safe, determining when to travel, and learning which alliances, even temporary, ensure the protection of family and livelihood. Beyond material survival, social structures strain under the pressure of war. Peasant obligations to lords remain, but enforcement is inconsistent. Displaced families and refugees from contested areas arrive, stretching resources and increasing competition. Villages form makeshift councils to manage food distribution, maintain order, and organize defense. Ordinary people begin to take responsibility for maintaining stability in ways that previously might have been reserved for nobility. One striking feature is the war's intimacy. Unlike foreign invasions, these battles are fought by neighbors, cousins, and distant kin. Betrayal is not abstract, it is personal. A Yorkist knight may have been raised in your village, your cousin's friend. A Lancastrian lord may have visited your home in past festivals. Allegiances shift fluidly, and trust becomes conditional and fragile. Survival often depends on navigating these relationships carefully, choosing discreetly whom to support and whom to avoid. In towns and villages, everyday life becomes a balance between endurance and ingenuity. Farmers plant crops with the knowledge that harvests might be taken by armies. Merchants hide valuables in secret caches or transport goods through obscure routes. Women and elders assume leadership roles when men are conscripted or forced to flee. Skill in daily survival bartering, negotiation, alertness is as vital as any military tactic. Religion and ritual provide structure and solace, but they too are influenced by conflict. Priests bless departing soldiers, perform funerals for those lost in skirmishes, and offer guidance. Churches sometimes serve as temporary shelters or command posts. Faith, for many, becomes intertwined with practical survival. Prayers to avoid suspicion, to protect livestock, and to maintain morale amid unrelenting uncertainty. The battles themselves, while dramatic, are only part of the story. Many conflicts are fought in whispers, rumors, and small-scale skirmishes. Villages are raided, fields burned, and livestock stolen. Civilians die not only from sword and arrow, but from famine, disease, and exposure caused by the disruption of normal life. You come to understand that war is as much about attrition, disruption, and uncertainty as it is about decisive victories on the battlefield. Leadership on both sides is unstable. King Henry VI's mental instability creates openings for ambitious nobles. Richard, Duke of York, and later Edward IV maneuver politically and militarily, alternating between victories and setbacks. Each turn of fortune impacts ordinary life. Taxes increase to fund campaigns, conscription widens, and armies march through homes, taking what they need. For villagers, politics is tangible only in its consequences: lost food, vanished neighbors, and constant tension. And yet the human capacity for endurance persists. Communities reorganize. Families protect one another. Knowledge of the land, social networks, and timing become survival tools. Ordinary people, though powerless in the grand schemes of kings and nobles, develop their own strategies to preserve life, culture, and identity amidst the chaos. Their resilience is quiet, uncelebrated, but essential to the kingdom's continuity. As the war continues, a pattern emerges. England is a kingdom caught between ambition and survival, where ordinary people bear the consequences of decisions made far above their heads. The cyclical nature of battles, occupation, and revenge ensures that uncertainty is constant, yet life continues in subtle, persistent ways. And as you endure these cycles, the question becomes inevitable. In a world where power is claimed and reclaimed by distant relatives and ambitious nobles, what does it mean for ordinary people to truly survive, and at what cost to their freedom, identity, and peace? By the late 15th century, the Wars of the Roses have worn England thin. Generations have grown up knowing only intermittent conflict, shifting allegiances, and the constant anxiety that the next army marching through their town might bring death, requisition, or displacement. For ordinary people, survival has become a refined skill, anticipating danger, concealing loyalty, and enduring scarcity. The struggle reaches its climax with decisive battles such as Towton in 1461, a bloody confrontation that sees Edward IV of the House of York emerge as king. The scale of death is staggering. Estimates suggest tens of thousands killed, many civilians caught in the aftermath. For villagers, the consequences are immediate and personal. Neighbors gone, fields abandoned, roads unsafe, and taxes rising to support new garrisons and armies. The notion of victory is distant, filtered through the lens of who now controls the county rather than who won the battle. Edward IV consolidates power, but England remains fractured. Loyalists of the Lancastrian line are persecuted or driven into exile. Small uprisings continue intermittently. Ordinary people must navigate these political shifts carefully, balancing survival against ethical or familial obligations. A villager may shelter a Yorkist one day, then quietly aid a Lancastrian fleeing persecution the next. Every choice carries weight, and every misstep can be fatal. The psychological toll of decades of civil war cannot be overstated. Families have lost generations of men to battle. Fields lie fallow intermittently, as labor is drawn away to serve one side or the other. Trade is disrupted, and markets only partially recover. Religion offers ritual and guidance, but the church is intertwined with power, and faith alone cannot protect against a sudden raid, conscription, or punitive taxation. Survival is practical, strategic, and deeply psychological. The final phase of the conflict comes with the rise of Henry Tudor, who claims the throne through both Lancastrian and strategic marriages, uniting the two warring houses. The Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 ends Richard III's reign and effectively concludes the Wars of the Roses. For ordinary people, this marks the end of open conflict, but its effects linger. Land disputes remain, debts to soldiers are unpaid, and communities rebuild slowly, forever marked by a century of uncertainty. The war leaves lessons etched in memory. Ordinary people learn the fragility of political power, the transient nature of military victory, and the importance of local alliances and foresight. Survival is less about valor in battle and more about patience, prudence, and the subtle negotiation of authority. Villagers who once hid their grain or sheltered fugitives find that their quiet acts of resilience ensured continuity through centuries of turmoil. Despite the devastation, life adapts. Families reconstruct homes, reclaim fields, and repair trade networks. Local governance strengthens in pockets, often led by those who survived and endured, carrying with them a cautious wisdom born of repeated danger. Cultural continuity, customs, festivals, local traditions provide stability in the midst of disruption. Ordinary life in small increments resumes its rhythm. The broader political landscape also benefits from the hard-won lessons of endurance. By uniting the warring houses, Henry VII establishes a monarchy more cautious, pragmatic, and aware of the consequences of internal strife. The nobility, tempered by decades of bloodshed, learns that overt ambition without careful calculation can lead to ruin. Yet the memory of suffering persists among the common people, a quiet testament to the cost of dynastic ambition. As you reflect on the Wars of the Roses, it becomes clear that history is not only shaped by kings, generals, or battles, but by those who survive the interstices of power. The villagers, peasants, and townspeople who endure starvation, conscription, and displacement. Their resilience preserves communities, sustains traditions, and allows society to continue, even when rulers rise and fall like tides. And as peace finally settles, one final, sobering question lingers. After decades of civil war, where power is claimed and reclaimed by ambition and blood, what is the true measure of survival for ordinary people, and how does endurance shape the character of a nation long after the last battle is fought? Story 8. The Italian Wars, Mercenaries, Diplomacy, and the Cost of Fortune. You wake in northern Italy in the late 15th century to a landscape that seems at first serene. Rolling hills, vineyards, bustling towns, and the distant clatter of church bells. Yet beneath the surface, the peninsula is a tinderbox of competing ambitions. City-states like Florence, Milan, Venice, and Naples are wealthy, vibrant, and proud, but they are also vulnerable. Foreign powers from France to Spain cast eyes on these territories, eager to exploit division for conquest. Survival here is subtle, precarious, and often dependent on alliances forged as much by money as by loyalty. The Italian Wars, beginning in 1494, are a collision of dynasties, mercenaries, and diplomacy. For you, a resident of a small town near Milan, the conflict is less about kings, ambitions, and more about the practical realities of occupation, supply, and survival. Armies pass through roads that your family uses for trade. Mercenary companies, the infamous condottieri, demand payment or threaten violence. You quickly understand that a soldier's allegiance is fluid. Today he serves Venice, tomorrow Florence, and the next, perhaps whoever can pay his wages. Survival requires reading intent, hedging bets, and sometimes simply hiding in plain sight. The French, under Charles VII of France, begin the invasion with a rapid, well-funded campaign aimed at claiming Naples. Their arrival transforms the countryside overnight. Villages are requisitioned for food, horses, and lodging. Nobles negotiate with invaders, sometimes betraying neighbors to preserve lands. Every encounter carries risk. Ordinary life, the rhythm of planting, trade, and worship, is disrupted as armies use your town as a staging ground or strip it bare for provisions. The condottieri complicate matters further. These professional soldiers of fortune fight for payment rather than loyalty, and their methods are pragmatic, brutal, and opportunistic. You might wake to find your farm occupied, your grain confiscated, or your neighbors forced to serve as laborers or guides. Every day is a negotiation, a balance between compliance, concealment, and resistance. Ordinary skills, knowledge of the terrain, social connections, quick thinking become essential for survival. Diplomacy in Italy is constant, intricate, and dangerous. City-states form temporary alliances, bribe armies to avoid destruction, or purchase mercenary services to protect their borders. Letters, envoys, and subtle signals are as critical as swords. You observe that for ordinary citizens, these machinations are less abstract than they appear. The outcome of a treaty, a bribe, or a secret alliance determines whether your village is plundered or spared, whether your family prospers or suffers. Sieges like those at Pisa or Novara bring the war to your doorstep. Artillery grows increasingly destructive. Cannons rattle walls, demolish towers, and terrorize civilians. Starvation and disease often claim more lives than the fighting itself. You witness, perhaps for the first time, the brutal reality that even a city with strong walls is vulnerable to modern siegecraft. Survival becomes an exercise in patience, resourcefulness, and sometimes sheer luck. Economic disruption is relentless. Fields lie untended, trade routes are blocked, and markets are commandeered by occupying forces. Merchants adapt, creating secret networks or smuggling goods to safer towns. Farmers adjust planting cycles, hide grain, and rotate livestock to minimize loss. Every ordinary act of subsistence becomes a strategic choice, a quiet rebellion against the unpredictability imposed by war. Religion, art, and culture continue amid this chaos, though they too are influenced by the shifting power dynamics. Churches offer sanctuary, but they cannot guarantee safety. Festivals, guilds, and civic rituals adapt, balancing celebration with the constant reality of risk. You notice that life persists, but it is altered. The ordinary becomes extraordinary in its endurance, the mundane acts of survival heroic in their quiet persistence. Amid all this, the question of loyalty is constant. Who deserves aid, and who may betray you for advantage? Nobles and commanders may switch sides overnight. Condottieri change employers. Foreign kings pursue distant claims with devastating local consequences. Ordinary citizens navigate these uncertainties with subtle cunning, adapting to changing circumstances to protect family, property, and life itself. As you move through this landscape town to town, farm to field, market to church, you understand that survival in the Italian wars depends not on valor or fame, but on observation, timing, and adaptability. The choices you make each day, whom to feed, whom to hide, which routes to use, are as consequential as the movements of armies. Life is fragile, yet stubborn, persistent, and quietly defiant. And as you watch armies march, mercenaries negotiate, and treaties signed that you may never read, one question lingers in your mind, as persistent as fear and hope intertwined. If fortune and power shift constantly around you, and life is defined by the ambitions of others, how can ordinary people preserve continuity, dignity, and a sense of control in a world ruled by hired swords and distant kings? The Italian wars are no longer distant headlines, they are the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the pounding of artillery on city walls, and the sudden arrival of armed men at your village gates. As Charles VII pushes south toward Naples in 1494, northern Italy becomes a patchwork of disrupted towns, requisitioned farms, and displaced people. Survival is no longer a matter of farming or trade alone. It is a continuous negotiation with armed forces, shifting alliances, and the unpredictability of fortune. Mercenaries, the condottieri, dominate much of the conflict. Unlike noble armies loyal to dynastic causes, they fight for payment, their allegiance purchased, their loyalty often fleeting. For a village like yours, this is terrifyingly pragmatic. A mercenary captain might protect your town one day and plunder it the next, depending on the flow of gold. You learn quickly that protection is temporary, that favors must be earned, and that every act of kindness toward an armed stranger carries risk. Survival is subtle. Discreet gestures, hidden grain, temporary obedience, and the cultivation of strategic alliances with local authorities or powerful soldiers. Cities under siege, Milan, Pisa, Florence, demonstrate the devastating combination of modern artillery, siegecraft, and political calculation. Cannons thunder against centuries-old walls, dislodging stones with terrifying precision. Gates are undermined, towers breached, and the psychological effect on civilians is immense. You observe families retreating from homes, livestock abandoned or stolen, wells contaminated, and disease spreading quietly but inexorably. Hunger and despair become as deadly as the swords outside. Trade, once a lifeline of northern Italy, collapses in contested zones. Merchants reroute shipments, hiding goods along obscure routes. Farmers adjust planting cycles, divide harvests, and bury food for emergencies. Towns form councils to manage dwindling resources, organize defenses, and negotiate with armies to reduce pillaging. Each ordinary act tending a field, sharing a loaf, guiding travelers becomes both a survival strategy and a moral decision, weighing the immediate needs of family against long-term risks. Political alliances shift constantly, and ordinary people must navigate them with care. Florence might ally with Milan one month and oppose it the next. French, Spanish, and papal forces intervene sporadically, altering the balance of power overnight. You notice that your neighbor's fates often depend on subtle factors: which noble passes through, which army is paid first, or which town council negotiates most effectively. In such a world, knowledge of local geography, personal relationships, and the character of soldiers is as vital as courage or farming skill. Religion provides a fragile sense of stability. Churches offer sanctuary, aid, and spiritual guidance, but they cannot shield anyone from artillery or theft. Priests negotiate with mercenary captains, bless the wounded, and maintain civic rituals, allowing the population to cling to a sense of order. Yet the intertwining of politics, warfare, and faith demonstrates a stark reality. Survival requires adaptation, not merely piety. Despite the chaos, resilience emerges. Families conceal valuables, hide livestock, and find ways to maintain commerce despite plunder. Communities reinforce walls, guard supply lines, and share intelligence about troop movements. Even children and the elderly play roles in defense or survival, fetching water, repairing damage, and communicating news. Ordinary life continues not by ignoring war, but by navigating its constant, unpredictable disruptions. The long-term effects of the Italian wars become clear in these moments. Villages rebuilt from fire and plunder carry scars for decades. Generations grow up learning the rhythms of occupation: when to flee, when to submit, when to hide. Knowledge becomes communal, encoded in stories, gestures, and habits passed quietly from parent to child. Ordinary survival in these times becomes a skill as vital as literacy, as essential as trade. Through the lens of daily life, you see that war is not just battles and conquests, but attrition, disruption, and negotiation. It is in the small victories: protecting a granary, keeping neighbors alive, maintaining a market route, that history is lived. Nobles and kings may rewrite maps, but the continuity of ordinary existence relies on subtle strategies, quiet courage, and persistent adaptability. And as armies move, treaties are signed and broken, and towns are besieged, you cannot help but wonder. If fortune and power shift constantly, and mercenaries decide the fate of your home with little warning, how do ordinary people sustain life, culture, and community in a world defined by hired swords and the ambitions of distant rulers? By the early 16th century, the Italian wars have transformed the peninsula into a stage of perpetual conflict. Northern cities like Milan and Florence have been besieged, pillaged, and occupied multiple times. The rhythm of life for ordinary citizens, farmers, artisans, traders is measured not by seasons alone, but by the arrival or departure of armies, the shifting allegiances of condottieri, and the whims of distant kings. Survival becomes an art, honed over decades of uncertainty, danger, and negotiation. The wars, climactic moments, battles like Fornovo in 1495 or Marignano in 1515, are remembered in chronicles and official records. Yet for villagers, the consequences are indirect yet deeply felt. Fields are trampled, granaries emptied, livestock stolen, and entire neighborhoods temporarily occupied. Even if you do not wield a weapon, your life is shaped daily by the ripple effects of these military maneuvers. Shortages, taxation, conscription, and the constant presence of soldiers, loyal not to nation but to pay. Mercenaries continue to dominate much of the conflict. Their loyalty is purchased, their methods pragmatic, and their morality situational. You learn that bribery, negotiation, and strategic generosity are as crucial as caution. Ordinary citizens are forced to cultivate a sense of diplomacy, anticipating threats, weighing allegiances, and sometimes risking disobedience to ensure survival. The line between compliance and self-preservation is thin, and mistakes are often fatal. Political shifts, treaties, and invasions complicate matters further. France, Spain, the papacy, and the Holy Roman Empire all exert influence over Italian affairs, often using local factions as proxies. A treaty signed in Florence may protect one town while exposing another to invasion. Nobles, aware of these dynamics, exploit them for advantage, sometimes betraying neighbors, sometimes fortifying local positions for mutual benefit. For ordinary people, understanding these complex webs becomes vital. A wrong assumption about loyalty, timing, or allegiance can bring devastation. Despite the chaos, communities adapt. Villages fortify positions, create underground storage for food, and develop networks to share intelligence about troop movements. Trade routes shift to safer paths. Families conceal valuables and protect livestock. Artisans continue to work, repairing damaged homes or maintaining infrastructure. Children and elders contribute, performing roles essential to survival, gathering water, tending animals, or relaying messages. Every act, however mundane, becomes a measure of resilience. Religion, too, plays a dual role. Churches and monasteries offer sanctuary, guidance, and a semblance of stability. Priests mediate between armed forces and civilians, negotiate temporary truces, and maintain communal rituals. Faith, while comforting, is intertwined with survival strategy. Prayers are as much for protection as for spiritual guidance. In some cases, the church itself becomes a tool of negotiation, lending influence to mediate or delay destruction. The cumulative effect of decades of war is profound. Generations grow up knowing disruption as normal. Survival requires observation, patience, and adaptability. Communities carry scars from repeated sieges, occupation, and plunder. Oral history, local knowledge, and practical skills become the currency of endurance. Even when armies depart, life does not immediately return to normal. The process of recovery, repairing buildings, restoring fields, rebuilding trade can take decades. Yet amid the devastation, remarkable endurance emerges. Families reconstruct homes, merchants restore markets, and communities maintain cultural traditions. Knowledge is preserved and transmitted quietly. Which fields are safest, which routes avoid marauders, which alliances protect rather than endanger. Ordinary people do not simply survive. They innovate, adapt, and sustain life under conditions that could have crushed them entirely. As power eventually consolidates, France asserts influence in Naples, Spain in Milan, and the papacy navigates alliances. Italy remains fragmented but resilient. The peninsula is forever shaped by these wars. Cities fortified, armies professionalized, diplomacy refined, and local populations hardened by necessity. For the ordinary people, the legacy of the Italian wars is not the shifting borders on a map, but the skills, patience, and communal cohesion developed in response to decades of instability. And as you reflect on your life in this turbulent landscape, the question lingers, as vital now as it was during the first invasion decades earlier. When kingdoms, mercenaries, and distant ambitions dictate the rhythm of life, what does it mean to endure, and how do the quiet acts of daily survival shape the history that is written by kings, but lived by ordinary people? Story 9. The Spanish Conquest of the Aztec Empire, between empire and survival. You awaken in the bustling heart of Tenochtitlan, capital of the Mexica whom Europeans call the Aztecs circa 1519. The city rises like a jewel in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Causeways connect its island core to surrounding settlements. Canals carry canoes laden with maize, cacao, and obsidian, and the scent of flowers, smoke, and cooking fires fills the air. You are accustomed to its rhythm. Merchants calling prices in the marketplace, priests performing daily rituals, children learning to swim through canals, and farmers tending floating gardens called chinampas. Life is organized, intricate, and above all, resilient. The Mexica Empire has expanded across central Mexico, binding conquered city-states into tribute networks. For you, a resident of Tenochtitlan, this is both a source of pride and a complex reality. Tributes from food to textiles to labor arrive and depart daily. Warriors train in academies, preparing to defend the empire or subjugate neighboring polities. Society is highly stratified. Nobles, priests, artisans, and commoners coexist under strict codes of duty, honor, and religion. Life is ordered, but the demands of empire weigh on everyone. Survival is about compliance with societal expectations, resourcefulness, and vigilance in a city of tens of thousands. Yet the world beyond the lake is changing. Across the Atlantic, Spain is emerging as a maritime power, driven by conquest, trade, and religious ambition. In 1519, Hernán Cortés arrives on the shores of Mexico with a small force of soldiers, horses, and firearms. At first, their numbers seem insignificant, fewer than 600 men, a handful of horses, and primitive artillery. For you, these strangers may initially appear curious, exotic, or dangerous, but their presence is not yet understood as a prelude to cataclysm. Cortés is methodical. He seeks alliances with city-states long resentful of Mexican dominance. He exploits divisions, mistrust, and internal rivalries. Every encounter with these Europeans is laden with uncertainty. You hear stories of strange weapons that thunder across the lake, horses that thunder like beasts of legend, and men who speak in a language unknown to your people. Fear mixes with curiosity. The rhythms of your city rituals, trade, governance persist, but an undercurrent of tension grows. Disease lurks invisibly, although you do not yet recognize its scale. Smallpox, measles, and influenza, carried unknowingly by Europeans, travel faster than armies. Though invisible, they will have consequences that ripple through the city, altering the balance of survival and mortality in ways that no strategy, ritual, or warrior can control. For now, you notice only that some of Cortés's men appear sick, and some local allies show early signs of illness, but the full scope remains unfathomable. The Mexican rulers, including Emperor Moctezuma II, face an unprecedented challenge. Should they treat these foreigners as guests, as divine signs, or as enemies? Decisions are weighed in councils, messengers carry conflicting reports, and priests interpret omens. For you, ordinary life continues, but the fabric of your city, its economy, hierarchy, and social trust is under stress. Every day is punctuated by preparation. Food storage, maintenance of canals, repair of defensive structures, and careful observation of newcomers. Mercantile activity remains vital but fraught. Markets bustle, but transactions are shadowed by the fear of occupation or plunder. Artisans continue to craft tools, garments, and ritual objects, understanding that the survival of their skills is tied to the survival of the city itself. Children learn by imitation, preparing for a world where knowledge of survival, obedience, and adaptation is as crucial as literacy or arithmetic. Even in this ordered society, survival requires flexibility. Tributary provinces send envoys, sometimes loyal, sometimes treacherous. Alliances shift subtly. Ordinary citizens, farmers, fishermen, weavers must navigate these dynamics, balancing civic duty with self-preservation. A misstep can have immediate consequences: loss of food, forced labor, or conscription into military campaigns. Yet despite the growing threat, Tenochtitlan exhibits remarkable resilience. Its canals, gardens, aqueducts, and causeways are feats of engineering, supporting tens of thousands in a dense urban environment. Knowledge accumulated over generations ensures that, for now, life continues. Food reaches markets, water flows, temples operate, and governance functions. Survival is a daily exercise in both routine and vigilance. Still, an unsettling tension grips every moment. You notice the foreign soldiers exploring nearby settlements, the rumor of alliances forming, the subtle manipulation of local enemies by strangers whose intentions are opaque. Life, once predictable, now depends not just on farming, trade, or ritual, but on observing power, anticipating betrayal, and navigating an environment that is shifting faster than your ancestors ever imagined. As the city prepares for the possibility of confrontation, one thought shadows every action, every decision. When a civilization as sophisticated and resilient as Tenochtitlan faces outsiders with strange weapons, unknown diseases, and unanticipated alliances, how do ordinary people understand, prepare for, or survive the forces that history has brought to their doorstep? By late 1519, The shadow of the Spanish expedition under Hernán Cortés stretches across central Mexico. For you, a resident of Tenochtitlan, life has become an intricate balancing act, maintaining daily routines while understanding that the world beyond the lake has changed irrevocably. Cortés is not merely a foreign invader. He is a master of alliances, diplomacy, and psychological strategy. The Spaniards are few, but they wield firearms, ride horses, and manipulate internal divisions among the tributary peoples, forces far beyond the normal considerations of survival. Early encounters are marked by observation, negotiation, and subtle manipulation. Cortés exploits resentment against Mexican dominance in neighboring city-states, securing allies from Tlaxcala, Colula, and other regions. For ordinary citizens in Tenochtitlan, these alliances are confusing and alarming. Allies of the Spaniards now march near your city, bringing both promise and peril. Their arrival complicates trade, travel, and communication. You must anticipate where armies will pass, which alliances might shift overnight, and how to protect family and property amidst uncertainty. Moctezuma II, the emperor, faces impossible choices. Should he welcome the Spaniards and treat them as potential divine signs, or repel them immediately? His indecision is not simple caution, it reflects the limitations imposed by unfamiliar technology, complex social hierarchy, and political necessity. Orders are issued, rituals performed, and observers stationed to watch the foreigner's behavior. Yet for you, these high-level deliberations have immediate consequences. Soldiers stationed nearby may requisition food, artisans may be conscripted to maintain warcraft, and markets fluctuate with the presence or absence of foreign forces. The first clashes outside the city foreshadow the violence to come. Skirmishes between the Spanish and Mexican troops, though small in scale, cause panic in surrounding villages. Trade routes are disrupted. Grain and fresh water supplies are redirected or commandeered. Families conceal valuables and livestock, and in some cases, flee temporarily. Even the simple act of walking through town becomes a strategic exercise. Routes must avoid military patrols, bridges may be blocked, and rumors of ambushes circulate constantly. Inside Tenochtitlan, daily life becomes a tense negotiation with the invisible forces of war. Food distribution must be recalibrated. Aqueducts and canals are maintained under strain. Religious rituals continue as much for morale as for tradition. You see artisans repairing damage from minor skirmishes, children learning practical survival skills, and elders teaching observation and cautious judgment. Ordinary survival is no longer passive. It is an active practice requiring foresight, adaptation, and quiet courage. Disease, invisible yet lethal, spreads among both allies and citizens. Smallpox, brought inadvertently by the Spanish, begins its quiet devastation. Families lose children, parents, and neighbors with little warning. You learn that no amount of preparation or bravery can entirely protect against microscopic forces that travel faster than armies or diplomacy. Survival becomes a delicate dance between human ingenuity and the unpredictable realities of biology and circumstance. The psychological strain intensifies as alliances shift. The Tlaxcalans, once enemies of Tenochtitlan, now support the Spaniards. Colulan betrayal results in massacres that send shockwaves through the city. Every day is an exercise in vigilance, assessing friend from foe, interpreting subtle signs, and deciding which areas of the city are safest. Ordinary people must act as both observers and participants, balancing obedience to local authorities with independent decisions to protect themselves and their families. Logistical challenges amplify the crisis. Tenochtitlan is vast, but its reliance on canals and causeways makes it vulnerable. Food and water movement becomes a task fraught with risk. You notice that people are rationing maize, fishing more intensively, and coordinating to ensure that the most vulnerable children, the elderly, and the sick receive sustenance. Survival depends not just on personal action, but on cooperation within neighborhoods, forming micronetworks of protection and resource sharing. As the Spanish consolidate alliances and prepare for a siege, the city begins to feel the first constraints of encirclement. Canal routes are blocked, boats seized or destroyed, and movement restricted. You experience the creeping awareness that the familiar world, the rhythm of markets, festivals, and daily routines is under siege. Even simple acts like transporting water or repairing homes become exercises in risk assessment and endurance. Amid these pressures, one fundamental truth becomes apparent. Survival in Tenochtitlan is not solely a matter of martial skill or political allegiance. It is about observation, adaptation, and quiet persistence. Ordinary people, farmers, artisans, merchants, laborers become the backbone of resilience, sustaining the city's economy, infrastructure, and social cohesion even as the tides of conquest sweep closer. And yet, even as you work to protect your home, your family, and your community, the shadow of uncertainty lingers, heavier than any weapon. When allies can become enemies, technology changes the rules of survival, and disease spreads unseen. How can ordinary people endure a siege that threatens not only their lives, but the very structure of their civilization? The siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 is unlike anything the city has ever endured. The Spanish, led by Hernán Cortés, now command a force reinforced by thousands of indigenous allies, particularly Tlaxcalans, who seize the opportunity to challenge Mexican dominance. The city, once vibrant and orderly, transforms into a landscape of barricades, canals filled with debris, and rooftops crowded with families seeking safety. For ordinary citizens, survival is measured not in months or years, but in hours. Food and water become urgent concerns. The Spaniards, with allies controlling access to the surrounding lakes and causeways, cut off supplies. Farmers who once tended chinampas now hide or abandon their crops. Market stalls stand empty or are plundered. You witness neighbors rationing maize, fishing in canals under constant threat, and scavenging from destroyed boats. Survival requires ingenuity, collaboration, and relentless vigilance. The psychological strain is constant. Fires break out in residential areas, explosions from artillery throw debris into streets, and disease spreads unchecked. Smallpox, which had arrived silently months before, now ravages families. You see friends, children, and elders fall ill, and the knowledge that no skill, weapon, or strategy can fully protect against this invisible threat weighs heavily. Endurance becomes both a physical and mental exercise, maintaining hope, community, and courage even as death surrounds you. Defensive efforts are heroic but insufficient. Mexican warriors fight with extraordinary skill and courage, utilizing the city's canals, causeways, and elevated platforms. Ordinary citizens reinforce walls, guide escape routes, and care for the wounded. You might carry water to soldiers or hide valuables, each act a quiet defiance against overwhelming forces. Yet for every act of courage, Spanish artillery, superior weaponry, and strategic alliances undermine the defenses. The city begins to feel smaller, constricted, and increasingly desperate. Alliances, betrayal, and political complexity play out in real time. Some indigenous communities see the Spanish as liberators from Mexican tribute demands. Others remain loyal to Tenochtitlan. Civilians are forced to navigate these shifting loyalties, making choices about whom to help or hide from. Even seemingly neutral acts, sheltering a friend, providing food, become life-and-death decisions. Ordinary survival now involves constant observation, rapid assessment, and flexibility. As the siege progresses, the city's structure, its roads, canals, and buildings deteriorates under relentless bombardment and fire. Homes collapse, temples are damaged, public spaces are unsafe. Families improvise, storing food in hidden caches, reinforcing bridges, and moving vulnerable members to less exposed areas. Life becomes an improvisational struggle where adaptation and cooperation are essential. You realize that survival is as much about cleverness and resourcefulness as courage or strength. Emperor Cuauhtemoc, Moctezuma's successor, demonstrates extraordinary leadership in this desperate moment, organizing defenses and attempting to maintain morale. For ordinary citizens, these actions are both inspiring and terrifying. The collapse of leadership would mean chaos, but even under capable leadership, the odds are grim. You witness that endurance, coordination, and commitment to communal welfare are critical to sustaining life, even as external forces tighten their grip. After months of siege, the city falls. Tenochtitlan, once a jewel of Mesoamerica, is captured, largely destroyed, and absorbed into the Spanish colonial system. Survivors are dispersed, enslaved, or relocated. Cultural practices are suppressed, and indigenous structures dismantled. For you, the world has irrevocably changed. Familiar routines, social hierarchies, and urban landscapes are replaced by foreign authority, new languages, and unfamiliar systems. Yet human endurance persists. Families regroup, knowledge is preserved, and communities adapt within the new colonial framework. The conquest's long-term effects are profound. Though the Mexica state has fallen, the knowledge, skills, and cultural memory of its people endure. Survivors carry traditions, agricultural expertise, and social cohesion into new towns and colonies. Ordinary life trade, farming, crafting continues, adapted to the realities of colonial rule. Survival is no longer measured in the preservation of a city, but in the continuity of culture, identity, and community despite catastrophic change. In reflecting on these events, a powerful lesson emerges. Empires may rise and fall, armies may conquer, and disease may devastate populations, but ordinary people sustain life. Their endurance, adaptability, and quiet acts of survival preserve knowledge, tradition, and culture long after the symbols of power temples, palaces, and kings have vanished. Life continues in small, persistent ways that history books often overlook. And yet, even as Tenochtitlan's stones crumble and its warriors fall, one question lingers. When a civilization is overwhelmed by forces beyond comprehension, foreign armies, disease, and betrayal, what truly endures? The city itself, the memory of its people, or the ingenuity and resilience of those who survive to carry its legacy forward? Story 10. The 30 Years' War, Famine, Faith, and the Ordinary Lives of Europe. You awaken in Central Europe in the early 17th century to a landscape that seems deceptively calm. Mist rising from the fields, the scent of freshly tilled soil, the distant church bells calling villagers to morning prayer. Yet beneath the surface, the Holy Roman Empire teeters on the brink of catastrophe. Religious tension between Catholics and Protestants has been simmering for decades. Political alliances are shifting like sand, and now a local dispute in Bohemia threatens to ignite a war that will engulf the continent for 30 years. For you, an ordinary villager, survival will depend not on the movements of kings or generals alone, but on your ability to navigate famine, disease, and the unpredictable consequences of warring armies. The 30 Years' War begins in 1618, sparked by the defenestration of Prague, when Protestant nobles throw imperial officials out of a window in rebellion against Catholic authority. For most people in the empire, the event itself is distant, yet its consequences ripple outward immediately. Armies begin to move, levying supplies, seizing livestock, and conscripting men for campaigns. Roads that once carried merchants and pilgrims are now dangerous arteries through which soldiers march, bringing both danger and the possibility of plunder. You learn quickly that your life is entangled with conflicts far beyond your control. Villages adapt cautiously. Ordinary citizens take precautions, securing grain, hiding valuables, reinforcing homes, and establishing watch routines for approaching soldiers. Each day carries subtle calculations who might pass through, which local lord offers protection, and how to avoid punishment from either side. Even seemingly mundane activities like fetching water from a well or repairing a fence become exercises in risk assessment. Survival depends on observation, timing, and prudence as much as on strength or courage. The movement of armies brings more than violence. It brings disease and famine. Soldiers carry not only weapons but also typhus, dysentery, and other infectious diseases. Food supplies are confiscated or destroyed, crops trampled under marching boots, and herds slaughtered or stolen. Villagers respond by rationing, cultivating hidden plots, and relying on less obvious food sources: wild herbs, river fish, and preserved grain stored in secret. Life becomes a daily negotiation with scarcity. Even the act of sharing food with neighbors or travelers carries risk. Generosity may attract soldiers, but withholding assistance can erode community trust. Religion compounds the complexity of survival. Catholics and Protestants vie not only for political control but for spiritual supremacy. Churches, monasteries, and chapels are sites of worship, but also of negotiation, coercion, or looting. Priests and pastors navigate a treacherous path, blessing armies one day, consoling refugees the next. You notice that faith, while offering solace, cannot shield against bullets, hunger, or disease. Survival requires blending spiritual adherence with practical strategy, balancing devotion with pragmatism. Markets, trade routes, and urban centers are equally affected. Towns under frequent occupation see prices skyrocket, currency devalued, and trade networks disrupted. Merchants employ ingenuity, creating hidden networks, smuggling goods, or relocating to safer towns. Farmers plant fallback crops, harvest in secrecy, or barter with neighbors. Knowledge of the terrain, seasonal patterns, and the character of local commanders becomes invaluable. Ordinary survival is a combination of skill, foresight, and quiet cunning. Communication is sporadic. Letters, messengers, and rumors are unreliable. News of battles or troop movements may take days or weeks to reach distant villages, and often contains exaggeration or misinformation. You must rely on personal observation, local intelligence, and intuition to make decisions that could mean life or death. Even mundane choices: when to tend livestock, when to repair fences, when to travel to the market, become critical survival strategies. Despite the chaos, ordinary resilience shines. Families maintain households, care for children, and preserve knowledge and skills even under extreme stress. Communities cooperate to defend their homes, share scarce resources, and maintain social cohesion. You witness the quiet heroism of villagers who repair bridges under threat, distribute water during droughts, or protect those unable to flee from marauders. These acts, while small, form the backbone of endurance in a continent torn by war. Yet as armies clash, rivers run red, and fields lie fallow, an uncomfortable truth emerges. Survival is precarious, continuous, and dependent on both foresight and luck. Even the best planned precautions cannot shield against the randomness of war, the spread of disease, or the collapse of harvests. Ordinary life is a constant exercise in adaptation, observation, and endurance. And as you watch smoke rise from distant towns, hear the distant clash of steel, and navigate the uncertainty of daily survival, a persistent question lodges itself in your mind. When famine, disease, and shifting religious and political alliances dominate the landscape, what strategies allow ordinary people to endure, and how does daily resilience shape the course of history, even when the rulers and generals seem oblivious to human suffering? By the 1620s, the 30 Years' War has spread across the Holy Roman Empire, transforming once familiar landscapes into zones of constant uncertainty. Armies of varying size, imperial, Protestant, mercenary, and regional levies, move unpredictably, stopping in towns and villages for supplies, conscripting men, and often leaving destruction in their wake. For you, an ordinary villager, survival is no longer a seasonal matter. It becomes a daily calculation of risk, resource management, and social navigation. Occupation is a persistent reality. Soldiers billeted in homes demand food, livestock, and lodging. You may host a group of imperial cavalry one week and Protestant infantry the next, each bringing a mixture of threat and protection. Compliance ensures immediate survival. Resistance risks violent reprisal. Families must decide when to comply, when to hide resources, and when to flee entirely. Even the smallest acts, storing grain, concealing tools, or tending livestock, require careful judgment. As armies, needs often override local law and custom. Raiding and plunder are not limited to the battlefield. Small groups of soldiers, mercenaries, or opportunistic locals exploit instability. Crops are burned, wells fouled, and homes looted. You witness neighbors fleeing with whatever possessions they can carry, or returning to find their land stripped bare. Survival becomes both physical and psychological. The endurance to rebuild repeatedly, the vigilance to anticipate threats, and the adaptability to respond to crises with minimal resources. Disease compounds the challenge. Typhus, dysentery, and influenza travel alongside armies. You see family members fall ill with frightening speed, and entire households sometimes vanish within weeks. Knowledge of herbal remedies, hygiene practices, and quarantine measures, often passed quietly from one generation to the next, becomes a matter of life and death. Communities organize to care for the sick and bury the dead, sometimes under the threat of occupying forces. Ordinary people become both caregivers and strategists, balancing empathy with practical constraints. Famine is equally relentless. Soldiers consume stored grain and disrupt planting cycles. Villagers cultivate fallback crops, gather wild plants, and hunt wherever possible. Fishing in rivers or lakes becomes essential, though it carries risk when armies occupy the surrounding areas. Trade networks are fractured, markets unreliable, and currency often worthless. You learn that survival depends on resourcefulness and creativity, rotating labor, bartering with neighbors, and maintaining hidden reserves of food and water. The smallest miscalculation, delayed planting, missed rationing, or misjudged generosity can result in catastrophe. Religion plays a complicated role. Churches and monasteries continue to serve spiritual and practical functions, providing food, shelter, and guidance. Priests, pastors, and abbots often mediate between local populations and occupying armies, negotiating protections or securing temporary truces. For ordinary people, religious rituals are both a source of comfort and a survival strategy, offering opportunities to maintain social cohesion, protect vulnerable members, and appeal to local authority in times of crisis. Community bonds become lifelines. Families, neighbors, and local councils coordinate efforts to secure resources, defend homes, and share intelligence about approaching forces. Ordinary acts, helping a sick neighbor, repairing a damaged bridge, or guiding travelers through safer paths, become vital contributions to collective survival. Endurance is communal as much as individual. No one survives alone, and collective wisdom accumulates in ways that formal chronicles often overlook. Despite these pressures, human adaptation persists. Villagers develop subtle strategies to anticipate army movements, observing smoke, listening to distant drums, and tracking patterns of mercenary pay schedules. They learn to negotiate with occupiers, sometimes offering limited provisions to secure protection, other times hiding resources to survive future threats. Even children and elders contribute, fetching water, tending animals, or serving as lookouts. Ordinary life becomes a continuous exercise in observation, prudence, and adaptability. The cumulative effect of decades of warfare leaves deep imprints. Repeated cycles of occupation, plunder, famine, and disease erode social structures, yet also foster resilience and ingenuity. Knowledge of survival, what crops to plant under uncertainty, how to safeguard valuables, whom to trust, is passed from one generation to the next. Communities that endure do so not through luck alone, but through careful observation, collaboration, and the quiet accumulation of practical wisdom. As the war rages on, one truth becomes unavoidable. The rulers, generals, and religious authorities may wage campaigns and negotiate treaties, but the continuity of life, the preservation of households, skills, and community rests in the hands of ordinary people. Their ingenuity, endurance, and quiet resistance sustain civilization even in the face of relentless disruption. And as you observe smoke rising from distant towns, hear the drumming of distant armies, and ration your stores of grain and water, a question lingers in the back of your mind. When armies occupy your home, disease spreads unseen, and famine stalks the land. How can ordinary people endure, and what does survival look like in a continent where power, faith, and violence are intertwined beyond their control? By the late 1640s, Europe begins to glimpse the end of the 30 Years' War. Exhaustion pervades every aspect of life. Armies are depleted, cities lie in ruins, farms remain fallow, and populations have been decimated by violence, famine, and disease. For you, an ordinary villager, survival has been a marathon of endurance, observation, and adaptation. Every step repairing walls, rationing food, tending livestock has been a negotiation with circumstance, necessity, and human cunning. The signing of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 brings official recognition that hostilities will cease. Armies begin to withdraw and political borders are codified, but the consequences for daily life are profound and long-lasting. Villages must rebuild from literal rubble, homes reconstructed, bridges repaired, fields cleared of debris, and canals restored. Labor is scarce, as generations have been lost to battle, conscription, and disease. You notice that recovery is slow, painstaking, and reliant on both individual effort and communal cooperation. Communities adapt in remarkable ways. Farmers innovate with resilient crops and new planting techniques, carefully observing seasonal patterns disrupted by decades of conflict. Artisans restore tools, homes, and infrastructure, often improvising with limited resources. Markets gradually reopen, though trade remains fragile. You see that ordinary survival has become institutionalized. Knowledge of crop rotation, food preservation, and resource management is passed down and codified within local networks. The lessons of war scarcity, vigilance, and adaptability become permanent aspects of daily life. The human toll is evident in every village. Families have been fractured, children orphaned, laborers missing. Yet these losses foster resilience. Social bonds are strengthened among those who remain. Shared hardship creates networks of mutual aid. Neighbors assist one another with rebuilding homes, caring for children, or pooling resources to restart trade and agriculture. Ordinary people, who once navigated daily threats from armies, disease, and famine, now apply the same ingenuity to restoration and survival in peacetime. Religion continues to shape life, but its role evolves. Churches and monasteries that served as sanctuaries, aid centers, and community hubs during war now become spaces for reflection, reconciliation, and organization of civic life. Priests and pastors help maintain social cohesion, mediate disputes, and ensure that ritual reinforces shared values. Faith provides continuity, a stabilizing force amid the disruption of social and physical landscapes. The psychological impact of decades of war is less visible, but no less real. Generations have grown up knowing only instability and uncertainty. Ordinary people carry memories of loss, destruction, and violence. Yet, paradoxically, this lived experience also nurtures skills in anticipation, adaptation, and survival that persist across generations. Children who learn to evade raiding soldiers, ration scarce food, and navigate shifting allegiances become adults capable of managing crises in new and unpredictable contexts. Endurance, once a survival mechanism, now becomes a defining feature of communal identity. Even as the formal political structures of Europe stabilize, the subtle effects of the war remain. Villages that endured repeated occupation develop local governance structures to protect against future threats. Knowledge about disease management, emergency food storage, and early warning systems becomes embedded in communal practice. Ordinary people, often overlooked in grand historical narratives, are the custodians of practical knowledge that ensures the continuity of life, culture, and society. Yet despite the resilience, you notice that survival has changed the nature of everyday life. Communities are smaller, more cautious, and more tightly interconnected. Social mobility has been limited by population loss and economic disruption, yet the collective memory of crisis creates opportunities for cooperation and innovation. Ordinary people have learned that endurance is not passive, it is active, strategic, and deeply human. Life continues, but it carries the imprint of decades of upheaval in every field tilled, market reopened, and child raised. As peace settles over Europe, the quiet reflection on survival becomes inevitable. Kings, generals, and diplomats have signed treaties and redrawn borders, yet the story that endures is that of ordinary people. The farmers who preserved seed, the merchants who sustained trade, the women and elders who maintained households, and the communities that rebuilt themselves against staggering odds. Their efforts, largely invisible in official histories, define the continuity of life and civilization. And as you walk through the recovering village, tending crops and repairing a home that survived fires and occupation, one final question presses itself upon your mind. After 30 years of war, famine, and disease, when rulers have fought and treaties have been signed, what truly defines resilience, the survival of a city, the endurance of families, or the quiet ingenuity of ordinary people who rebuild life from the ashes of history?